Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
Is this what an evening board meeting looks like now? Emily greeted her husband's secretary at the office door with an unkind smile as she gasped for breath, buttoning her blouse. "Let me pass, my dear." Like an impending thunderstorm, she walked into the office of her husband, who, with one hand hastily removed from the desk the effects of recent passion, and pulled on pants. "Can I help you? Is it cold?" Emily asked, folding her arms across her chest. Everything inside her was standing, burning, and resentful. This man, on whom she had spent 10 years of her life, oblivious to her own dreams and ambitions, now stood before her with his pants half pulled down and could not utter a word. "Emily." "No comment." She interrupted him. "How was it?" "By all accounts, the director's meeting went well." "Emily, stop it. I can explain everything." He finally buckled his belt and moved toward her. "Stay where you are," abruptly cried out the girl from the surprised trader, froze in place. "What for?" His eyebrows drew together. "Don't make a scene." I wanted to throw tantrums, and I wanted to vent my anger on him. But my natural restraint got the better of me. "I'll wait for you at home." She turned on her heels and walked out of the office with her head held high. Here she was at last. "Are you going to cook dinner at all?" Miranda's mother-in-law was very kind. She met Emily in the lobby. "While David's plowing, you're driving around to your friends." Yes, David really earned it on his own. Emily looked at the 60-year-old woman, just on fire at work. "What?" Her mother-in-law's eyebrows rose indignantly. "Tell your son when he comes home that I'm waiting for him upstairs, and someone else will take care of dinner tonight." And Emily, with a short nod, headed for the stairs. My mother-in-law was taken aback. She looked after her daughter-in-law, who had never allowed herself such liberties before today. It had been 3 years since Miranda had moved into her son's house under the pretext of hypertension, and she had never been spoken to in that tone before. What kind of fly bit her? It's a worthless girl. The daughter of the school German teacher. Never liked her. And once David got the idea to marry her, well, they met at the institute, fell in love, and then broke up, looking for a mate from her circle. How she, Miranda, dreamed of marrying David to the daughter of her crony friend, the Harris of the jewelry business. Instead, her son married this homeless beggar, and even a red degree in design didn't make her a more attractive match. Finding herself in her room, Emily collapsed on the bed and closed her eyes. More resentment flooded her, tears rolling from her eyes on their own. She had been almost as hurt when her mother had died. She had burned so quickly that the girl hadn't had time to say goodbye to her properly. It had been 2 years since that terrible day when, holding her only daughter's hand, that heroic woman left the world, for Emily did not know her father. Her mother said he died before she was born. She had no more relatives left in the world. Wendy pulled her along on her meager teacher's salary. While Emily was in school and in her first year of college, she supplemented her main job with part-time tutoring and scrubbing floors at the local supermarket. Sometimes her daughter wouldn't see her for days. She would come home, exhausted, tired. But she never complained about life. She had no men, although quite a few suitors tried to take the vacant place next to her. The woman was intelligent, beautiful, and lonely. Emily knew that her father was her only love, whose fidelity she kept all her life, sometimes falling into a longing for her mother. The girl dialed her home phone number and listened to the long, dull ringing tone. And now she was 30 years old. No kids, no job, and now no husband. Emily knew she would never be able to forgive this betrayal to him. Truth be told, their marriage had been bursting at the seams for a long time. They married for mutual love right after university. 3 months later, David's father died, and her husband inherited a lucrative construction and landscaping business. He then made it clear to her that she had to quit the job Emily had taken in her 3rd year and take care of her home and not think about any career. At the time, it seemed to her that this was fair, and she willingly plunged into the family hassle with the hope that soon there will be children, but they did not appear. All the necessary examinations and procedures were done. They even began to consider their options, but everything changed in an instant. Miranda came into their home, and Emily stopped feeling like the master of her own life. Yes, she still made repairs, planted flowers in the garden, and cooked crazy lunches and dinners, a server and a chair like in Lennon's restaurant. Except that the feeling of safety and security was no longer there. Emily stood up from her bed and wiped away the tears flowing in a waterfall. She looked at the clock on the bed on the nightstand. The hand showed 9:00 p.m. To get her mind off herself and relax a little, she headed for the shower. Barely a girl threw off her clothes and turned on the water. The front door slammed on the floor below. Damn it, we have to hurry, she thought, and just in case, she clicked the lock on the door as well. While Emily stood under the hot streams, her thoughts slowly came to order. The sobs subsided, and she put a terry towel over her ear and threw on a robe. She stepped out of the shower. The bedroom was still empty. Emily walked over to the mirror, where a slender, brown-haired woman with a mole above her lip was looking at her. A short, trimmed leading hair picturesquely framed her flippers, her face. Opening her closet, she pulled out jeans and a t-shirt and turned into them and left the room. There was no one in the hall, the living room, or the kitchen, so no one had come. That Miranda was out for the night, probably on a broomstick, Emily thought, and grinned bitterly. In the living room, she walked over to the antique sideboard, where her pride, a magnificent service made of the finest medical porcelain, was displayed. She had bought it during her honeymoon in the German town of Worms. David wondered at the time why you couldn't buy that kind of junk instead of carrying it halfway across Europe. But beautiful tableware, especially vintage ones, was Emily's passion. Now she would have to leave it all behind, for David would probably not let her take anything. Not because he needs it. It's just the way he is. There were footsteps in the hallway, and the next second she heard Emily's husband's voice. "You're the one." How she wanted to throw something at him. "I'm right here." She turned to him. "I want to explain, don't I?" He started to ramble as he sat down on the couch. "Come here, please." He pointed to the armchairs beside her. Emily went silently and sat down in the place indicated. She wanted to look him in the eye, to ask why. But she silently stared at the newspaper lying on the coffee table. She just did not have the strength to look at him. "You'll stay silent." His voice suddenly sounded irritated. "Really? You're not going to ask him anything? Or don't you care?" She finally found the strength to look at him. She saw a strange man standing in front of her. "Ask me what?" She grinned. "When did it begin?" "I'm guessing, because your evening meetings and business trips started exactly 3 months ago. Maybe earlier, though." "What's her name?" "I know that too. Helen. I think I know that she's 23. But you know the reason." David leaned back and put one hand on the back of the couch, showing he wasn't embarrassed. "I'm at a loss for ideas." Her voice trembled treacherously, but she pulled herself together. "Yes, because you've become so boring you want to forget. You're always in the kitchen or running around and taking your stupid China junk. Damn it, there's nothing to talk to you about except your pink tastes and your girlfriend's shoes. You only have wacky maiden, a tank with a curious nose and a sharp tongue." Maiden tank. Would not like it, Emily thought. She listened, and anger boiled in her soul with resentment. The girl could not utter a word, though she should have reminded this man that she had sacrificed a successful career, the dream of one day opening her own business for the sake of their marriage. About the fact that for 3 years now she had tolerated in the house his bored and selfish mother, who tried in every way to humiliate her. "Have you finished even?" Emily asked. Only her tightly pressed lips, which defeated her knuckles, indicated that she was very tense. "No," he was quiet for a second. "Helen is 5 weeks pregnant, to be exact. I think Mom will be happy she's finally going to have a grandchild or granddaughter." He spoke in such a casual tone, as if they were discussing a menu, a named lunch. It was a punch in the gut. Emily closed her eyes and tears ran down her cheeks. What a bastard you are. How could I have lived with you for so many years and not notice it as much as I could? His words literally exuded venom. My darling, 2 years of a relationship and 8 years of marriage have made you a woman of high society, a rich woman. You know very well how much your pastime is worth. Besides, you escaped the poverty that you and your mother ate your one-bedroom with the alcoholic neighbors behind the wall. After this phrase, Emily could not stand it and stood forward and slapped him with a resounding slap. Oh, you bitch. The retaliatory slap was immediate, and Emily fell into a black abyss. In the morning, she called the only person she had left close to her after her mother left and David betrayed her. Hi, Evelyn. Emily tried her best to make her voice sound smooth and relaxed, but it still shook. We'll be able to meet right away today. What's the matter? Her friend's anxious voice made her smile. It happened, and I really need to talk to you. Of course, I'm getting dressed now. Evelyn's dark glasses raised the precipice in surprise when they met a couple of hours later at their favorite coffee shop. This was new, considering that it was raining outside. Emily sat down across from her and silently removed her glasses. Her friend's eyes were red and bruised. My mother's woman. What is it? Emily, from where? From there, the girl answered dryly. Life is changing, people are changing. Or opens up, maybe. Is it really, David? Emily took a deep breath and told Evelyn. Yesterday's story meant that she was pregnant. She flopped down in her chair and looked intently at her friend. What are you going to do? Forgive him. If you do, I'll interrupt you myself. Emily averted her eyes and looked outside, where we had a dreary October rain. Leaving. How can you live with a man who betrayed you, who dared to raise his hand? But you sue him for his part of the estate. Evelyn popped another sugar cube into her latte. This whole thing makes even me stressed out. I don't think I'm going to make it. Yesterday, when I woke up from his slap, she hobbled off. My beautiful spouse informed me that I was leaving home with what I came in with. That is, as you understand, without everything. He did, however, allow me to take some clothes and some jewelry that he had given me. The car, of course, remains in the future wife and mother of his child. That's exactly what he said. What a bastard. Don't worry. We'll figure something out with the job. The most important thing is to leave this bastard with dignity. By the way, you can move in with me. Emily gave her a paved smile. Thank you, sweetheart. But I'll go back to my mom's apartment. But nobody's lived there for years. Can you imagine what's there now? That's where Mom is. She's there in everything, in the books, on the shelf, in the picture frames in the air. And it's the only place in the whole world where I want to be right now. Really, she herself didn't notice the tears flowing from her eyes. Evelyn simply held her hand in silence as she mourned her pain and resentment. Finally, Emily resolutely wiped her tears away with her palms and smiled weakly. So stop feeling sorry for yourself. She clapped her hands on her hips. Let's ask for the bill. You don't have to go to the apartment and clean it up. I'll go with you, of course. But you have work to do. I'll ask right now. Evelyn, with her chowder pen, pulled out the latest iPhone from the bowels of her bag and dialed her boss's number. Thank you, silently, Emily whispered as she made up a story to her boss about her sore throat and the beginning of her fever. They brought the bill and the girls. Relaxed, they headed for the exit. The front door lock barely clicked, and a streak of light fell on the hallway floor. Emily became agitated. She hadn't been here much since her mother's death, and now she felt uneasy. Once inside, her friends smelled the distinctive smell of an uninhabited room. It smelled sad and empty. Emily, with a familiar motion, turned on the light and walked into the kitchen. Evelyn followed her. It was, as always, clean, and the back of the kitchen set, a gift from her son-in-law for his anniversary, and slightly ruined by dust. It was practically empty except for the drawers that held the old dinner service. The refrigerator door was open, as if someone had just taken out milk, and one of the chairs had been pulled out from under the table. Emily thought she was about to hear footsteps in the hallway, and her mother would come in. They will all sit down together, as they used to, at the round table, pour tea from the soul, and talk about the little things that life really consists of. Evelyn, catching her friend's mood, broke into a loud cough and began rattling the cupboard in search of the kettle. While she was tinkering in the kitchen, Emily walked into the room. Here everything remained the same as it had been under her mother's reclining couch, dust covered with sheets. The simple but elegant wallpaper that the two of them had glued together the week before they had learned the terrible diagnosis. Emily repeatedly offered to buy her mother a flat-screen modern TV, but she always flatly refused. Apparently, Emily got her love of vintage things from her mother. She opened the dam of her closet, where her clothes were still hanging. There was no way the girl could bring herself to part with the things that held her scent. Remembering her, she took the sleeve of her blouse in her hands, held it up to her face, and breathed in the scent of the perfume her mother had always spritzed on her wrist. God, how she missed her. She was distracted from her sad thoughts by Evelyn's voice, who informed her that she had made tea. Feeling back in the kitchen, Emily found that her friend had already managed to dust off, relive the teacups, and make tea. Discovered in the tin box above the sink, the girl smiled appreciatively at the scrolls. "What would I do without you, really, what?" She shrugged, taking a chocolate bar out of her bag. "That's how I knew. Just bought it this morning in the subway." They quickly drank tea and changed into their old clothes, began to put things in order, sweeping away the newest cobwebs from the ceiling wall, fresh to the kitchen to shine, cleaned the fans and the bathroom toilet. The girls sat down to rest. The curtains remained to be taken down, and the hardest part was rubbing the books and crystal into the walls. "I'm not taking them to you now." "You know what?" Evelyn looked enigmatically at her friend. "What's to fall in love with?" That Emily coughed in surprise. "Is that all you need?" "No, really. Do you need some good emotions right now?" The girl moved toward her friend, taking her hand. Looking into her eyes, "Worried for you." Emily shook her hand gratefully and smiled. "I can handle it. You know I'm strong. Come on, let's just get this over with." As if on cue, they both stared at the bookcases, which looked intimidating. Emily fetched a basin of warm water, and they, armed with rags, began carefully removing books from the shelves, wiping and dusting off another spine of the bindings. She smiled to herself. Her mother had amassed a whole library. It had everything, and Emily never had to look elsewhere for works from the school curriculum. Wendy had a special love for German literature. Hoffmann, Grass, Remarque, even Patrick Suskind, and even Goethe and his Faust, and Emily herself, thanks to her mother, knew almost by heart. Evelyn was humming something about herself, carrying a tray with volumes of War and Peace. Behind her, an impressive pile of dust-free folios had already landed. She was doing everything clearly and quickly, unlike her friend. Emily, on the other hand, was in a strange nirvana, giving herself to the memories that held the pages of these old and beloved books. She searched with her eyes for Goethe. It was a large antique book in German, dated 1896, and appeared in the house before Emily herself. Taking it in her hands, the girl felt a strange thrill. The yellowed pages were decrepit and soft. Somewhere along the stretches of time, she stroked the roughness and surface. Suddenly, she felt that there was something among the pages. She flipped through them with her fingers and saw a small envelope wedged between pages 50 and 51. Carefully taking it in her hands, Emily felt that in the envelope there was something hard and heavy in addition to the paper. Her hands were sweating with excitement. She looked at Evelyn, who paid no attention to her, and pondered. To tell her or not, it must be about her family. Finally, she made up her mind. "Evelyn, come here for a minute." Evelyn was distracted by the cleaning of the bindings and headed toward her friend. "What have you got here?" "Wow," she glanced at the envelope. "And what is this letter?" Emily shrugged her shoulders. "I do not know." "Well, I'll open it then, Lord." Evelyn stood sideways at her arm and looked at her friend with a look as if she were a little girl. Emily nodded and opened the envelope. There was a folded piece of paper and a small gold ring with a blue stone. Wow! Evelyn jumped up and down, and with excitement Emily, completely unaware of anything, stared blankly at the piece of jewelry. She saw it for the first time and wondered where it had come from. After all, she and her mother had never had any secrets from each other. The stone was shimmering in the artificial light of the chandelier with 1,000 facets, and it looked like a real diamond. But where did the German teacher get the diamond ring? Emily was utterly confused. She and Evelyn sat down on the sofa and stared at the strange find. On the inside, there was a short inscription in German, A-S-H-A. A-S-H-A, what is A-S-H-A? Where did it come from? Oh, look, Emily. Evelyn pointed to a small badge on the same inside of the seer under the very stone. It was either a hallmark or a coat of arms. Well, very finely engraved. There's a magnifying glass. Emily perplexed at her friend. Well, to increase, seeing her confusion, explained it. Although wait, she stood up abruptly and rushed into the hallway. And a second later she was already taking pictures of the ring on her iPhone camera. She took a few pictures and then enlarged the image as much as possible. In front of her eyes was a drawing of Rose braiding a dagger on a shield. From the looks of it, it appears to be an antique ring, Emily stated. There's no modern hallmark here. I wonder where Aunt Wendy got it. I don't know, said the girl thoughtfully. Suddenly, she remembered the piece of paper that was in the same envelope. When she unfolded it, she gasped. Her mother's handwriting. It was a letter written in German. In the upper left corner, Emily made out the floor, alas, flowery lines with an address. Germany, Rhine City, Trier, Beverly Strasse, 28A, Schwarzenberg. Holding her breath, Emily began to read you to thank God for diligently learning German under the guidance of the best teacher in the world. Dear Alex, I am writing you a letter again, which will probably remain in my books again. And I apologize in advance. I am very guilty before you, but I could not do otherwise. Believe me, I am punished in full, for being away from you is the greatest pain of my life. There's a lot you don't know. Maybe it's for the best. Otherwise, you would still be trying to find me. I really want you to be happy with love. Wendy, September 5, the year 2000. Emily was silent. Tears flowed from her eyes. Wendy, what was writing? Was it a love letter? She simply did not know. Evelyn's sobbing distracted her from her thoughts. Her friend's eyes were wet too. How romantic was that? Emily. Who's Alex? Your mom's boyfriend. She never told me about it, did she? I was 10 when she wrote that letter. My dad died before I was born. Maybe they met later. Mom loved Dad very much. She never looked at anyone else. Who is this mysterious Alex anyway? Evelyn shrugged, and Emily wondered. The letter said it wasn't the first one written or sent. Maybe there are others to be found. In the books. Let's look. The cleaning can wait. It took them 3 hours. It had long been dark outside. The rain outside the windows had turned into a downpour, but there were 2 more letters on the table in front of them. One was found in Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. With trembling hands, Emily unfolded the first leaf. It was 5 years older. It was the same address. The handwriting was her mother's, too, but it was more fluid. The scribbles. She could tell a young girl had written it. It's been another year without you, my love. I can't bear to think of you so far away. Another woman beside you. I know your mother dreamed of this wedding, but what anguish did her dreams cost me? Don't look for me. I lost myself a long time ago. Forever yours, Wendy. Emily finished reading, and there was an awkward silence. Now I don't understand anything at all. Baby, I lost my whiskey. 1 more year, Emily repeated. 1 more. So it was before. But how? I didn't know anything about it. My head was spinning. Read it. The second one. Evelyn fidgeted impatiently on the couch. Emily unwrapped the last letter. The handwriting became different, tired and sad. On July 20, 2018, 1 week later, her mother died. The girl closed her eyes. She was suddenly afraid of what she would read in that scrap of paper. What secret would this last message reveal to her? My dear Alex, it is my last letter, my hopes to look into your eyes again. Alas, not destined to happen. 28 long years without you deprived me of strength and will to fight. I cannot tell you how much I regret listening to the voice of reason and others when I left your life. You may never know that I came home with a priceless gift for which I have tried to be happy all these years. This daughter of ours is the fruit of the most incredible, endless love that has forever settled in my heart. Yes, I am guilty of hiding, of running away, of disappearing from your life, of robbing you of the joy of being a father to Emily. I deprived her of a father's care and love. I realize now how foolish I've been to live my life hurting myself. You and Emily. She doesn't know anything. I don't have the strength to tell her. Forgive me and goodbye. Love of my life. Forever yours, Wendy. The girls sat in silence, staring into the void. The truth was revealed so suddenly, so harshly, that they could not find the right words. Emily struggled to comprehend what she had read as recently as yesterday morning. She was quietly baking cookies in her country kitchen. Everything in life was certain, clear, and predictable. No secrets, no cheating, no letters. It seemed like years had flown by since that moment. So what should I do? Emily broke the silence. She ran her hands over the priceless pieces of paper that preserved the secret of her birth. Evelyn took her hands and looked at her friend Emily seriously. Do you realize what you have just learned? You have learned that you have a real father who does not know about you. What is there to do here? Emily looked up at her. I really want to find him. But it could be that he's already. Think happy thoughts. Evelyn interrupted her. You're half German, aren't you? She laughed at her friend's amusement, and Emily smiled herself. They spent the next hour finishing cleaning up and discussing grand plans for a family reunion. A couple of days later, Emily was sitting across from David at a huge table in the lawyer's office, signing the divorce papers. Just like that, within 3 days, thanks to connections, she had become a free woman. The divorce left her with personal belongings, some jewelry, and still a sense of dignity, which she proudly carried receipts to work, along with a bottle of champagne and a box of ether. So that was it, Emily sighed. When her friend met her at the front desk of the publishing house, 9 years of marriage were a thing of the past. Evelyn hugged her tightly. Well, that's good. I never liked him. That was the plain truth. The mutual antipathy of husband and girlfriend had always left Emily utterly bewildered. 40 minutes till the end of the day. Wait a minute. Evelyn led her into her office with 1 million manuscripts lying all over the place. I don't have anywhere to be in a hurry. Feigning nonchalance, Emily said, clearing a place for herself on the small sofa. She liked the atmosphere of the study. There lived her creativity, 1,000 pieces of paper, in fine print, storing many stories, thoughts, and experiences. Lots of new names, addresses, booklets, from notes that were pasted here and there on the computer monitor, the system unit of the closet wall. Amadeus Publishing was considered one of the best in the region, and Evelyn, with her artistic taste for innate literacy, found her calling as editor. Emily herself, who graduated with a degree in landscape design, she dreamed of creating landscape masterpieces somewhere in the warm state, where there are no cold and snowstorms. Instead, she became a lonely, unemployed housewife and a divorcee to boot. These thoughts put her in a bad mood. She picked up the scrolls, picked up the first manuscript she could find, and before she knew it, she was reading. Ow! Earth to Emily. She heard her friend's voice above her ear. She was standing there already dressed in her cloak. She jokingly called her favorite poncho and held her coat in her hands. The friend stepped out of the noisy publishing house and plunged into the thick October twilight. The first stars had already lit up in the sky. It was dark and clear, with no hint of rain. It smelled of white leaves and wet asphalt. The city lived its usual life, and it did not care about other people's problems. He was leisurely preparing for winter, shedding his last garments in Central Park and seeing flocks of migrating birds off into the distance. The lock clicked. Emily opened the door to her mother's apartment. The place smelled different now. There were boxes of clothes everywhere, exuding the smell of her favorite linens, perfume, shoes, and cosmetics. The latter, however, was very little, for the girl preferred natural beauty. In the kitchen, the refrigerator was sticking out, half filled with food, and in a vase. On the table in a picturesque still life were grapes. The girls ordered pizza, and when the payoff came, they gave champagne to your new life. Evelyn gave a short but pithy toast to the search for her father. Emily added thoughtfully. They clinked their glasses and bought the liquid out of themselves. By the way, what are you planning to do? Looking for a job. Evelyn put some grapes in her mouth. My father first. Just don't know where to start. I don't even have a visa. And I overstayed my passport. Probably also need to figure out what kind of capital I have now. I think I should go to a pawn shop. Evelyn squinted at the pawn shop. Do you want to sell the trinkets your ex-husband gave you? Yeah, I don't have any other options right now. I've got a couple thousand cash in my wallet and an equal amount on my card. What am I gonna do with it? Spending a lot of utilities, groceries, travel. Again, not to mention the money for a new passport, visas, buying tickets. Emily bought a sip of champagne. But of course I can't help much with the money. But I will give you a price tip. Emily looked questioningly at her friend. She looked straight into her eyes. Rob called, which made Emily gasp for champagne in surprise. Are you out of your mind? What's the big deal? It's been so many years. Exactly. So many years you think he's still mad? Evelyn asked. Emily shrugged her shoulders. I'd be mad. I basically just left Rob. Emily and Rob had experienced what they call first love. It had been a delightful year. Their last class, the notes in their notebooks, the looks, the secret smiles, the long walks in the evenings. Their first kiss in the fall rain, when he walked her home after the fall ball. Exactly 13 years ago. And then there was graduation, the first adult sunrise of their very first time. All those images, like the frames of a movie, suddenly flashed before my eyes, a lump in my throat. They parted so incongruously. Emily went to Ulyanovsk State Institute in the Department of Design, and Rob went to the Moscow Academy of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Distance night calls, rare meetings on no, eternal, and sometimes not read text messages. Next, the girls realized that it's all over. A year later, Rob's parents died in a car accident. His little sister was taken to the country by her grandmother, and his visits to his hometown ceased altogether. A new life began for both of them, and Emily got David, a handsome, intelligent man from a good family. And only Wendy is sad that her son-in-law is David and not Rob. One day they did see each other, and that meeting nearly took Emily out of her mind. It was the day of her wedding. There was a knock at the door. Then she heard her mother gasp in the hallway. Here was the wrap-up. In her wedding dress, she walked out of the room and was stunned. In front of her stood her first love with a huge bouquet of roses. They looked at each other. I have lived through these years of separation, regretting the lost time. Rob didn't say a word. He just handed her the flowers and left. Emily, powerless, she sank down on the floor in the hallway and closed her eyes. She had never felt such pain before. She wanted to throw off the dress and run after him, but she didn't. Emily, what is it? Evelyn's anxious voice rushed her out of her thoughts. Do you think he still remembers me? She looked hopefully at her friend, who put her hands on her shoulders and smiled. I'm sure he does. If you must know, he's not even married yet. Oh, Emily brushed it off. How do you know? I know. He and I call each other sometimes. That you didn't say anything either. Emily glared at her. Evelyn nonchalantly poured champagne. Well, what were you happy with your husband? You were going to have a house and children. Why would you want to be hurt? Of course she was right. But Emily felt something akin to a pang of jealousy. They'd kept in touch all these years. He'd asked the girl about me, overwhelmed by an emotion she couldn't hide, no matter how hard she tried. Evelyn shook her head negatively. You are a taboo subject, so he doesn't want to talk to me, much less help me. Her friend stroked her arm cheerfully. And somehow, I don't feel that way. Call him. She pulled out her phone, and the next second, a message with Rob's contact popped up on the display. Thank you. Emily leaned forward and hugged Evelyn in an impulse. By the time they said goodbye, it was nearly midnight. Good thing tomorrow was Saturday. Otherwise, the Branches would have had to peck their noses all day at work, already lying in bed. Emily twisted her phone thoughtfully in her hands. She was scared to death to dial, but the desire to hear his voice again was unbearable. His handsome face appeared before her. The last time they had met, his gray eyes had been filled with pain and with regret. His lips kissed her neck so frantically. Hers had once turned into a thin line of resentment and disappointment. Oh, how well she remembered that expression, a deep look that had left a huge scar in her heart. Finally exhausted, she fell into a deep, restless sleep. She dreamed about her mother, Rob's school, and the whole kaleidoscope of events and memories. She woke up the next morning with a terrible headache, blaming it on the champagne she had drunk the night before. The girl quickly ran to the shower and poured herself a cup of coffee, sat down at the table in the kitchen, putting the phone in front of her. For 10 minutes she hypnotized him with her gaze, then gathered her wits and quickly dialed the number. I wish he hadn't picked up the phone, she thought to herself. Hello, a hoarse voice that sent shivers down her body. Emily answered her with a loss of her hand, and she nearly dropped the phone. What to say? Hello, Rob, hanged a long pause, and Emily thought that now she would hear a short ringing. Apparently, he recognized her. Emily, it's you, me. She didn't know what else to say. I didn't expect to hear you. Rob's voice was calm. How's it going? Good, and how are yours? The girl struggled to regain her breath. Her heart was pounding like crazy. I've been better. Rob snorted and asked without hesitation. What do you mean? Emily didn't understand. In the sense that we hadn't spoken in 13 years. And then suddenly you call me. What do you mean by that? Stupidly she repeated, and mentally I immediately scolded myself for it. Actually, a lot had happened. She wanted to tell him everything so badly that before her brain had time to react, she blurted out, "We can meet." She was immediately frightened of her own words. There was a short pause. Then came the answer. When and where? The coffee house, tomorrow 10:00 a.m. That would be fine. See you tomorrow. And Rob hung up. Emily stared at the phone as if it had grown ears. She did make an appointment. Yes, he said yes, didn't he? The tea went cold. Emily poured it down the sink and mechanically washed the cup and put it in the fridge. Did Evelyn bend the stars in delight when her friend told her about this morning's conversation with Rob? That evening they sat in the kitchen again, drinking instant coffee with steeped milk. An abomination, in Evelyn's opinion, but the day before Emily had bought a cappuccino and beat the wonderful milk foam with it. She sprinkled a little cinnamon on top and turned the ordinary black liquid into a delicious drink. Just like that. She smiled, embarrassed. Tomorrow's the meeting. Well done. Evelyn took a sip from the foam as well. A funny mustache was left on her upper lip. What are you going to wear? Emily shrugged. I haven't really thought about it, to be honest. Think about it. You have to look fabulous at least. And at most, she laughed. At most, you have to look like the woman he can't live without. The man sitting at the coffee shop table was so familiar to Emily that she could hardly suppress the lump forming in her throat. A slender figure, handsome, manly face, gray eyes, and dimples on his cheeks. When he smiled, he rolled onto the table and rubbed the menu pamphlet in his hands. Oh, those hands they had embraced and caressed her once. Emily realized what she wanted. Had it been all these years? No, sorely. She wondered to herself. dressed in retracted shields, jeans, a shirt, God, and the mossy Cossacks. She had felt confident a moment ago, but now all the confidence had evaporated somewhere. She plucked up courage, however, and headed for the table. Seeing her, Rob froze for a moment. Then he stood up to meet her. He hesitated awkwardly. "Hello," Emily smiled. "Thank you for coming." He, too, was wearing jeans and a shirt. Only unlike her, his shirt was austere, and so was his silvery look. They sat down across from each other. Silence hung over them. Emily knew he was waiting for her action, but she couldn't make up her mind. Rob looked at her as if she were the only one on earth. Well, she worked up the courage. "Are you waiting for an explanation?" He only shrugged his shoulders. "By the way, this is for you." He held it out to her. "Where did you get it?" "Sincerely surprised, girl. It's October." "Emily, you're funny, honestly." He even laughed, and in his voice she heard a long-forgotten, but familiar casual intonation. "In addition to October, it's also the 21st century." "Exactly," she muttered and smiled. "So what did you want to tell me?" Rob leaned back on the couch. "Why don't we order something first?" "Go ahead." Emily relaxed a little. She'd forgotten what it was like to be around him talking, to see him smile and squint his eyes. The waitress took her order for 2 lattes and a couple of deep ones, and they were alone again. Rob looked into her face. "Well, tell me. I'm getting worried myself." Emily looked up and flinched as his hand rested on top of hers. She felt the heat wash over her whole body. It was either embarrassment from fear or a sudden buildup of excitement. "I was divorced the day before yesterday." She wanted to say something else, but she blurted it out. "But you probably already know." "I just knowed," he said. His hand still rested on her arm. "So there's no point in telling about the past, because you know about it. I'm thinking of the main thing then. Do you remember what I told you about my father?" He nodded. "Well, none of that is true. He wasn't an engineer at all. As my mother said, he was a foreigner, or rather a German, whom my mother had met when she was young. They fell in love. She got pregnant with him for reasons unknown to me. He knows nothing about me and I about him. I found out about it myself a couple of days ago when I found my mother's letters that she wrote to him, but didn't send." Rob looked at her intently, listening, nodding, and Emily continued, "I only have the address and the name Alex Schwarzenberg." "That's not insignificant," Rob summarized. "Have you looked on social media?" "Nothing like that, or rather suitable. So you want me to run this information through service channels?" She nodded. Rob suddenly became sad. "So I was hoping for nothing, that you just wanted to see me." She flashed back. "Of course I wanted to, but I was embarrassed. I was scared to death that you were holding a grudge that you wouldn't forgive." He looked at her, and his eyes suddenly sparkled. "I forgave him long ago. As a matter of fact, I shouldn't have held a grudge. After all, our breakup was my own fault. But I was in such a mess. Everything was piled on top of school, losing my parents. Jenna was practically left in my arms. I mean, my grandmother was already sick. I hadn't considered the fact that you needed attention too. I thought you would wait as long as I needed. I had no right to think so." A traitorous tear slid down Emily's cheek, as if a huge boulder had fallen from his soul after his confession. "I waited. It's just that when you were completely gone, I thought you didn't need me anymore. So I decided to move on with my life. And when you came to my wedding day, I wanted to run after you, but I didn't because of David, because of my mother." He looked at her with all his eyes, just as he had 13 years ago. And that look was mesmerizing. They'd brought their order to distract them somehow. Emily drank a sip of the fragrant liquid. "Emily." Rob looked out the window at the gray sky with a smile. "You haven't changed at all. I haven't lost sight of you. Evelyn and I have called a lot over the years, and she's blabbed to me about everything about you, even though I didn't ask, and for that I am immensely grateful to her. We'll find your father for sure. It's just going to take time. I don't work for the authorities now. Why did the girl raise her eyebrows in surprise? You have dreamed about it almost since first grade, haven't you? I worked there, but not for long. My grandmother died. Jenna got cancer, and I had to quit my job to devote all my time to her. I had no one else besides my sister. Emily was stunned. She remembered very well. Rob's little sis. A ruddy little girl with blonde pigtails and silver, like her brother's eyes. Jenna has cancer. The girl repeated the word. It was as if she couldn't believe it. Rob nodded. A bone marrow transplant is required, but it costs a fabulous amount of money. I took out a loan for the maintenance therapy. But a job as a security guard in Europe still doesn't cover all the costs. But you don't have to worry about that, he warned Emily. Oh my God, Rob. I want to do something to help. He shook his head. I'm afraid there's nothing you can do. And I can see her. I can come and visit you. You want to come and visit? Reluctantly, Rob asked. Really, of course. Emily perked up. If you don't mind. He grinned and touched the edge of the glass with his finger. Frozen Jr. Actually, I don't mind. But Jenna won't be happy about it. Why not? Emily was surprised. But she thought it was clear. I'll find something to say. But then we can go right now. If you're not busy, of course. It's just that it's my day off, and I promised my sister a walk in the park. I'm free. Then let's go. He put the bill on the table and gave Emily a hand, taking her dressing room number. Rob walked confidently to the exit, and the girl, grabbing flowers and a bag, hurried after him, and one of them never touched me. When they got into the novelist's car, Emily asked him to stop by her house. There she pulled her favorite Italian handkerchief out of the closet and, putting it in a bag, left the apartment. Where are we going? Puzzled, the girl asked as they drove past the street where they used to live. Out of town, Rob answered, turning on his turn signal. When Jenna got sick, we sold my parents' apartment and bought a small house in the suburbs to be closer to nature. There's fresh air, a river, beauty there. He caught a glimpse of his companion. Have you changed your mind about going? No, of course not. Just asked Emily, something confused, and stared out the window. They drove almost all the way to the village in silence. Finally, Rob's Lassetti stopped outside a small house, boarded up in white and surrounded by a white wooden fence at night. Obviously, all its charms Blue left here in the yellow grass of the forest, but studded with fallen leaves in the fire on the red rowan trees near the porch. Emily smelled as soon as he got out of the car near the fence to the track of the chassis on the master's bench, spread out in the trees. Carefully, with the hand of the departed September, Rob was working the wicket door, letting the guests in front and right onto the path in front of them. With a happy bark, a huge shaggy dog came out. Emily cried out in surprise, and the animal began to cash her hands frantically, wanting a package. Look at him, Rob grinned. He patted it on the withers. And you turned him to the girl. You wouldn't know. Emily squatted down beside the dog, his tail lolling. Sherlock, does he really have to be 14 now? Yes, she remembered the time they'd walked together, then just a silly puppy on the boardwalk in the park. He had changed a lot since then. One thing remained the same, however, his easygoing nature and cheerful disposition. Emily hugged that head and smiled at her, suddenly so nostalgic that it gave her a sweet tickle under her spoon. She and Rob stroked Sherlock and looked at each other. A woman's voice came from somewhere. The young men raised their heads to the porch at once, dressed in warm suits, scooter jerseys, a hat. Standing there was a very thin, pale girl with bruises under her eyes and a poker face indicating that she was very sick. Hello, Jenna. Emily. She got to her feet and smiled. Jenna stared at her for a good 10 seconds. Then she turned around and went inside. Don't mind her, Rob reassured her. I'll be right here for a minute. He walked quickly toward the house and disappeared behind the door. Emily felt unspeakably lonely. Sherlock poked her in the palms of her hands with his wet nose at first, then simply lay down at her feet. Obviously, he'd spent all his energy on meeting an old acquaintance and now he was just stretched out, snorting, breathing heavily. Right across the path. It got cold. A wind came out of nowhere, and Emily wished she had worn a hat and her leather jacket didn't have a hood. But then the door crept open and Rob came out. Seeing her folded up from the cold, he practically paddled her and dragged her into the house. "Are you cold at all?" I'm sorry, please. I just had to tell her there was a tit." He spread his palms, her forearms, and looked at her with such longing that Emily felt hot. Surprised at her own boldness, she suddenly wrapped her arms around his neck and stood on tiptoe and pressed her lips together. He immediately responded to the kiss, gently and tentatively at first, then assertively, passionately. Surely they would have stood there in the halls making up for lost time. But the door to the house was open, and a mocking voice said, "Come in already." Oh my goodness. A knock was heard and all was quiet. Obviously, Jenna realized what she had interrupted and hurriedly retreated. Emily struggled away from the group, hiding her face against his neck. She suddenly felt like laughing and jumping. He was standing there, his arms around her waist, breathing heavily. "What on earth are you doing?" He whispered into her hair. "Do you want me dead?" She only shook her head no. "Come on, let's go." Rob grinned, then Jenna. "That's enough. Punch." They walked into the small hallway. It smelled of fresh firewood and something delicious that reminded them of their childhood, of their grandmother. "We need to fire it up." The stove. Light said businesslike, coming out to meet them. "It's cold at home." Her cheeks were still flushed with embarrassment, and Emily blushed too. Now Rob took his guest's jacket and went to deal with the heating. "Hi." Sveta stared at Emily point-blankly. "Come on in." The girl nodded and went into the room where the owner of the house stacked firewood. "Still beautiful," already peacefully murmured Light, following her. "Thank you. You're still just as pretty," Emily parried with a smile as she sat down on the fiddler and the couch. They both laughed, and the ice was broken. Pretty soon the room was filled with the sounds of happiness, their logs. Emily looked around the room where they were sitting. There were 2 more doors. Obviously, the bedroom furnishings were more than modest. Overnight, the thought of a measured, unpretentious life and a kind of peacefulness. With that of the modern things, the guest noticed a TV, a vacuum cleaner in the corner, and a cell phone standing on the charger. The whole atmosphere took her somewhere far away, and Rob misinterpreted her gaze. He explained, "Having sold the apartment, we bought this house because it was not expensive, and with the remaining money made the operation. Plus we had enough for a few more courses of chemo. That wasn't even in the kitchen yet." The Light snickered, raised a tablecloth on the table. "Let's eat already. My appetite's awakened today. You're not allowed to stand at the stove." The older brother frowned. "Was setting something up in there. I didn't scare you. I just put the chicken and potatoes in the oven. So don't be fooled by the foie gras tonight." She turned and disappeared into the doorway. Emily got up from the couch. "I'll go help her. I'm glad she hasn't lost her sense of humor." She looked at Rob with a smile, and meeting his appreciative gaze, went to get Jenna. They dined quietly, family style, talking softly and teasing each other, remembering that she hadn't come empty-handed. Emily handed an Italian silk handkerchief from a branch. She thanked her warmly, and tearing a knitted cap from her head, went to the mirror to try it on. They watched in silence as the skinny fingers of the pro-crow tied an intricate knot on the top of her head, and behind the chair they returned to a very different one. Jenna feminine. Content. Even a blush appeared. Emily didn't notice how time flew by, and a sniffle began outside the window. The rain was intensifying. Rob stared at her tensely, as if he wanted to say something. It was getting late, and Emily met his gaze. "I need to go home. I'll take you," he said disappointedly. "Just the car to warm up." "Stay with us." Jenna grabbed her arm. "You don't have to go anywhere tomorrow." Rob froze halfway through. Emily was at a loss. On the one hand, she really wanted to stay. On the other hand, she was afraid to force the issue, They had only just met after all these years. "No, I can't tonight. Maybe some other time." And seeing the disappointed light on Jenna's face, she added, "Why don't you come to my place? I do have an even smaller dwelling, but between us girls there will be a bed for you." Realizing that persuasion was useless, Rob went out into the shadows, and Jenna grabbed Emily's hand. "Emily, don't leak him anymore. You hear?" The girl stopped and stared at her with her eyes wide open. "He still loves you, if you don't plan on being with him. Leave now and don't come back. He won't survive a second time." Emily realized, suddenly, that the moment of truth had arrived, when she had no right to lie, no right to be cowardly, no right to teach, no right to wiggle. The question was clear and implied a straightforward and honest answer. "I will never hurt him. I love him too. Just don't tell them that." For now, Jenna nodded. Her face relaxed, and she finally let Emily out on her arm. Rob was waiting for her in the car. When she emerged from the gate, he climbed out of the cabin and gallantly opened the door of his Lacetti to her. "Thank you," he muttered. Not being able to look him in the eye slammed the door. He returned to his seat. "Thank you for what?" The girl didn't understand for the branch. "I haven't seen her so happy and alive in a long time. It's just great. I'm very glad I was able to help in some way," Emily said sincerely. The rain licked the windshield, muttering the radio. They were driving on the slippery highway, and the atmosphere in the cabin seemed hot to the extreme. Suddenly, Rob slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, turning off the ignition and putting the car on the handbrake. He moved closer to Emily and pulled her by the neck, beating his lips against hers. She surrendered to his power. Over her hands penetrated under his jacket and stopped where her heart was pounding frantically, her own heart thudding in her ribs. It felt like it was about to jump out of my chest. Finally, Rob pulled away from her, as if the years had never happened. "Barely breathing," he muttered. "I wish they weren't there," he muttered. She was at a loss for words in response. She just stared into his face and dissolved into it. It wasn't for nothing that they say first love is the strongest, most unforgettable. And in her case, apparently, also the only one. All the years of her life with David suddenly seemed to her like a farce, a production in which she was playing a role. The real her was here in this car with this man. They were looking at each other, moving closer again, about to touch her lips again. A phone call interrupted them from the sweet event. After 5 seconds of comprehending what was happening, Emily finally realized that the phone was beeping in her bag. When she picked up the phone, she heard the angry voice of Evelyn. "Mother, my woman. Who do you think you are? I haven't been able to reach you all day." "Evelyn, calm down. I'm fine." "Good for you," my friend said caustically. "I almost had a heart attack." "You're not home. You do not pick up the phone. What should I do? Where are you?" "I'm with Rob." There was a short pause. "Well," Evelyn's voice softened noticeably. "Then you're simplified. Say hello and call me when you have time, but don't take too long." And she disconnected. Emily stared at Rob with a smile. Shrugging, "I heard everything." He laughed and almost went deaf. What was she getting so worked up about? "Worried about me," Emily answered. "Let's go. Come on, let's go." Rob started the engine, and they drove leisurely down the wet highway. Near the door of her apartment, they kissed again. He declined the invitation to come in, for he didn't want to leave his sister alone for too long right in the driveway. Writing down Alex Schwarzenberg's details and his address, he said goodbye to Emily and left. Once home, Emily ran to the shower, jumped into bed, and dialed Evelyn's number and told her about the events of the day. She listened attentively, occasionally inserting phrases like, "Wow," and "I'm shocked." They chatted for about an hour until Rob texted me, "Thank you for the day." Emily smiled to herself and, closing her eyes, instantly fell asleep. It was quiet in the pawn shop, except for the cognacs of a huge antique clock standing as decoration near the counter under glass. The display case was full of things and rings to cameras and video recorders brought in by people in need of money. Emily felt extremely uncomfortable and insecure in her bag was everything she got from David. After the divorce, she and Evelyn were supposed to meet back at her house since she was afraid to walk down the street alone with such valuable things. But her friend was held up at work. She was too embarrassed to call Rob. Behind the counter, she was met by a dry-looking man wearing thick-lensed glasses. She looked like a leprechaun and laid out in front of him everything she had brought, namely, a pair of gold earrings with diamonds, a platinum ring with a scattering of tiny emeralds, a gold watch, and finally, an engagement ring. It wasn't worth much, of course, but Emily didn't want to leave it behind. Suddenly, the front door slammed, and she was relieved to see a panting Evelyn High. She literally rolled into the pawn shop. In a hurry, folding umbrellas like a blotting dog. "What a weather." "Hi," waved Emily to her. "You're just in time." The little man behind the counter cowered at the door. Apparently, he thought someone else might come in. Evelyn guessed his thoughts and leaned on the counter in a familiar manner. In a mock low voice, she said, "No, that's all. That's all we're waiting for." "Well, that's fine. Leprechaun, here we go." Half an hour later, the girls emerged into the pouring rain, satisfied and pleasantly surprised. The money they got for the jewels should be enough to cover their first time out of work, to find their father, and to go to Germany. "So much for my unsuccessful family life," Emily joked, clutching her purse with the money. The cab Evelyn had ordered stopped near them, and the friends hurried to it. As they drove to Emily's apartment, Rob called. She heard his low voice in the receiver. "Hi." The girl didn't notice how her face blurred into a smile. "Baby," she rolled her eyes and turned away to the window. "Emily, there's news about your father so quickly." She was surprised. Yes, there was silence on the phone, and Emily's insides went cold. "He's dead." "No. What are you saying?" "He's alive." Emily's tears suddenly flowed. Her hands were shaking, so she was afraid to drop the phone. "Can you come and tell me everything?" "Yeah, just a couple of hours to get the medicine off the branch." "Okay, thank you." Evelyn, anxious, looked at her friend. "So, what's going to happen there?" "He's alive." Emily laughed through her sobs. "My father is alive." Her friend looked at her and tears suddenly flowed from her eyes too. Continuing to cry, the girls embraced. The cab driver looked in the rearview mirror at a loss, pondering whether to tell them they were both drinking or not to get involved in this confusing matter. The girls were sitting in the kitchen with a bottle of valerian on the table in front of them. The time dragged on endlessly, so when the beep of the long bell sounded, they both snapped out of their seats. "Evelyn, hello," smiled Rob, when they opened the door for him. "What's up?" He froze, looking at the excited faces of the girls. "Come in," Evelyn commanded quickly. "Don't, Tommy, we're dying of impatience." The young man squeezed into the cramped hallway, which seemed to have shrunk in size, and began to take off his shoes. Once he had already accepted, Evelyn pushed him into the kitchen and sat him down at the table. Seeing the valerian, Rob grinned. "I think I missed it." Both girls looked at him with such a look that he hurriedly opened the folder he had in his hand and pulled out several pieces of paper and the fine print, handing them to Emily. He said, "Here you go, princess. You are in for a big surprise." Emily carefully took the documents and sat down in a chair. Her strength suddenly left her. Her head felt dizzy. "Don't worry, that's what you whispered to Evelyn. Read it to me." She began to read. Extract from the Register of Noble Families of Germany. Alex Manfred von Schwarzenberg, 12th generation. Date of birth, June 12, 1961. Place of birth, Germany. Rhineland-Palatinate. City of Trier. Parents, Hans Friedrich von Schwarzenberg and Birgit Elisabeth von Schwarzenberg, née Kaiser. Higher education in the humanities. Specialties in history, international relations. What followed were many dates of events and documents that told a brief history of Duke von Schwarzenberg's life. Emily stopped reading. She was confused and bewildered. Her father was a duke, and in the 12th generation too. Unbelievable. Oh, Mother, how could you keep all this from me? She thought bitterly. My mother is a woman. Evelyn broke the silence in the kitchen. Before you now, we must call your ladyship. No more, no less. She laughed. Vid, stop it. I can't believe it. It's all true. She turned to the other side. He nodded affirmatively. There isn't a picture, she asked hopefully. Alas, no. That's all I could find. Oh my God, said Emily. I thank you so much. You're welcome. He answered and somehow became sad. He watched her absorbed with the news of her origins. Suddenly, he thought there was no place for him in her life again. But pronounced Rob, slapping himself generationally and rising from his stools. If you don't need me anymore, I'll go. Emily frightenedly grabbed his arm. Evelyn tactfully walked out of the kitchen. Wait, don't go, please, Emily. He looked directly into her eyes. I'm not stupid. I know you're going away to look for your father now. And that is the right thing to do. But you won't come back here, leave me again. I don't want to die of longing for you again. Let me go now, please. She looked at him without taking her eyes off him. I can't lose you again like last time. And if you leave now, I'll follow you, and I don't care how it looks. You need to think. You have another interesting destiny ahead of you. There is nothing in my life except the work of hospital wards of debts for treatment off the branch. He held her hands in silver in his eyes, the sadness of the world. But I want to be in your life too. Yes, I will find my father, but he may not want to see me either. Who knows? And even if he does, it won't change anything. I can't let you go. At that moment they heard the front door slam. It was Evelyn who went home, leaving the two of them alone. Rob stood across from Emily, hesitant to believe what she had just said. She was looking at him so openly and sincerely. Her lips flushed her cheeks. Reflections don't tempt me. Emily, don't tempt me. Rom, I've been begging you for minutes now in a feigned angry way, she said. After all, I must keep my dignity. He smiled and brought his face close to hers. She immediately guided her hands and his neck lightly. He pressed his forehead against hers. You understand that I still can't breathe evenly when you're around. I could say the same, she whispered back. The hell with you, developing it again. What didn't the girl understand? Yes, my heart, he laughed nervously. I can't give up the joy now, to hold you in my arms, to kiss you until you make me, like our first time at the prom. Remember, she nodded. Pulling away for a moment, he picked her up on his arm, carried her into the room, and laid her gently on the couch. Time stood still, as if there had been no 13 years of separation, no resentments, no misunderstandings. There were only two men and women in love, longing for each other, so that the world around them ceased to exist. This evening belonged only to them. And then what would happen? It took a month and a half to apply for a new passport and a Schengen visa. During this time, Emily and Rob became close and practically never parted. Emily often went to the farm. She went for walks with Jenna, and the weather was fine. At the end of November, the days were clear and frosty. Finally, a one-way ticket to Philadelphia, Frankfurt, was bought, and Emily got busy packing her bags. As her departure drew nearer, Rob became withdrawn and moody, and did not answer his phone for long periods of time, disappearing into thin air. Then one day he showed up at Emily's house drunk. She had never seen him like that. Without saying a word and putting him to bed on the sofa, she sat there for a long time, gazing into his familiar face. In the back of her mind, she understood the reason for his behavior, but there was nothing she could do to change this trip. She waited with excitement and impatience, and he must have understood those feelings. After all, this was her father we were talking about. Rob woke up the next morning and apologized at length, and left without even kissing her goodbye. The flight was scheduled for December 23, and Rob volunteered to drive her to Philadelphia in his car. Emily didn't mind, for she wanted to spend more time with him, to talk to him, to reassure him that she would return once she'd met her father and gotten to know him better. The tension between them in the last few days had become unbearable. Rob was sullenly silent, and on the eve of departure, he simply grabbed her out of the group in the elevator and squeezed her with such force that she almost cracked her ribs. That night they made love frantically and passionately, as the last time. And in the morning he was aloof and alien again. Emily was very upset about that. She was also worried about how the envelope with the money she had left from the branch the day before would react. It wasn't much, but it would have been enough to cover a month's worth of medicine. When they said goodbye to her, Emily had made the girl swear not to say anything to Rob before she left. "Jenna, you know I'll be back." She looked seriously into the face of her man sister. "I won't leave you." That nodded and sobbed. Tightly she hugged Emily goodbye. The drive to Philadelphia took them 2 hours. In all that time, they'd barely exchanged a dozen phrases with each other. Rob stared intensely at the road, clutching Emily's palm in his hand. Words were unnecessary. Both understood that. They arrived in Philadelphia at 3:00 a.m. The flight was scheduled to leave at 6. The airport was crowded, as usual. Emily and Rob trudged through the crowd to the check-in counter with their suitcases, and they had only a few minutes to say goodbye. Rob looked longingly at Emily. "Emily, you're slipping away again," he said sadly. "I'll be back, I promise." She gusted, wrapped her arms around him, stood on tiptoe, and pressed her lips to his. Their breaths mingled. The flight was announced, and Emily, struggling to pull away from him, wiped away her tears, headed out to meet her past. On the plane, she calmed down a bit and tuned into the flight. The flight to Frankfurt was 8 hours long, and she had time to think about her actions. The thought that she might not be welcome in her father's house made her shiver again. He did not know, after all, that his sweetheart had been pregnant, much less that he now had a grown daughter. Perhaps he was happily married and had other children, and it may well be that she has brothers and sisters. The turbines rumbled. The plane rushed forward. She lifted off and hurtled off into the distance, hurtling toward the unknown. She thought. The airport of Frankfurt, the largest in Europe, was like an anthill. Countless terminals, floors, and check-in desks. Everything around was set up for Christmas. There were even photo areas with Santa Claus in each waiting room. Emily thought of Rob, who is on his way back home right now. Pulling out her phone, she tried to catch Wi-Fi to drop a message to him on the circuit. Plugging it in, she typed in a short text. "I've made the flight. Missing you already." Immediately a reply from Rob came in, and so did I. The answer seemed dry and one-worded to her. Immediately the mood soured. However, the girl nevertheless pulled herself together and went to get her luggage, while remembering to skim the message on the turn. From the airport, she took a cab to the train station, where she caught a train. She had several destination connections ahead of her, and she struggled hard to sleep. After all, she had spent the previous night on the road. In addition, she was exhausted by the flight-related travel. Excitement. Sitting down by the window, she watched the very unfamiliar scenery flashed by outside the window. Rocky hills of cavernous tunnels, and covered with thick growths of forest, windmills valleys with a scattering of tiny river girls with swimming ducks and swans, industrial area with huge warehouses and hangars, ruins of ancient castles on top of mountains, old Catholic churches with sad roofs. Emily always loved the unique comfort of old Europe with its cuddly bears, lush greenery, and good-natured natives. There was order everywhere. It seemed as if the inhabitants had made special preparations for the arrival of some important guest. The carriage Emily rode in was crowded. Mostly it was young people in jeans, liberal jackets, and Christmas hats, but also people from the East, from Asia, and God knows what other sides of the world. After 2 transfers, the girl finally boarded the train to Trier. It was a pity she hadn't taken care of the hotel, for she was literally knocked off her feet. She should have showered and fallen on any surface that resembled a bed. Besides, she was unbearably hot in her coat and warm boots, which seemed too light. Snow covered Philadelphia, finally, After a long flight and 3 train transfers, Emily stood in the center of the hall of Trier Station with 2 suitcases and a confused face. People were scurrying around, shrugging her shoulders, hurriedly apologizing, smiling, waving Christmas greetings. It was quite clear to her that she needed somewhere to sleep and gather her thoughts today. Before going to the cherished address, on top of that, she was starving because the last time she'd eaten was on a plane. A decent number of hours had passed since then. She stepped out of the station building into the city twilight, breathed in the cool winter air, and thought about the fact that somewhere in that city, 1,000 kilometers away from her home, lived her only family man. She had her mother's letters in her bag and a sapphire ring in case he didn't believe her. Thinking she needed somewhere to stay, she asked a pretty woman at the bus stop where the nearest hotel was. 20 minutes later, she was at the front desk of a small hotel on Baldwinstrasse, not far from the train station. After taking the keys and the porter, she asked if she could order his room for dinner. And upon receiving an affirmative answer, she headed for the elevator. On the 3rd floor, a tired, hungry Emily looked for her room and literally fell into it, dragging her suitcases behind her, dropping her coat and shoes. She collapsed onto a large steel bed behind a lilac bedspread. For a good 5 minutes she took a breath and calmed her train of thought, a worry in her head. The room was quite modest, but clean, tidy, decked out in lilac tones, furnished with modern, ivory-colored furniture. It reminded Emily of Provence, where she had been with her ex-husband. The girl quickly took a shower, in which she was happy to find soft slippers, fluffy terry cloth robe and clothes. In them, she ran to open the door. They'd brought dinner quickly with French fries, fried mushrooms with chicken, and she picked up a cup of tea and walked out onto the balcony, hidden behind the curtains, straight into her robe. In front of her stretched a bare alley, dedicated to leaning over it flamboyantly, not with the heads of lanterns. Trier. It wasn't a big city, but the streets were very crowded. Christmas lights sparkled and streamed everywhere. Bells were ringing. Music was playing. Emily thought also that it was a fairy tale time. It was the right atmosphere to symbolize the beginning of something new and good in her life. She went back to her room and got into bed, retrieving her mother's letters from her bag. She reread them again and pressed them to her face. It seemed to her that they still held the warmth and scent of someone who would never write anything to anyone again. Her eyes began to slip, and with an unbelievable effort, she pressed the light button. Emily drifted off to sleep. When she opened her eyes again, the sun was already high. It gathered through on the curtains and left a light streak on the parquet floor. Emily hung her feet off the bed and barefoot, walked like a window. Pushing that back against the wall, she let more light into the room and closed the balcony door. A frosty draught immediately burst into the room, chasing away the remnants of sleep on her face and replacing them with a blush. Her feet immediately froze, and the girl hurriedly put on her slippers. Today is Catholic Christmas Eve, thought Emily. How symbolic. She took a shower, then dressed long and carefully, choosing an outfit, folding her hair dryer, knotty curls, and doing her makeup. Then, putting back in her bag of letters, she forgot herself and walked out of the room into the hallway. Not far from the elevator hung a large mirror, and the girl looked at her reflection with approval. She was wearing beige slacks, bananas, a purse, a new sweater to match, patent, brown with large buckles, and an Italian shawl with ornaments and tassels. And only her hair brought some resonance to this elegant bow. The dark curls didn't want to lie down in any way, neatly thinking it was even more natural that way. Emily went downstairs near the front desk, and she spotted a rack of travel guides and bought one. There was a tourist map enclosed in it, and when she opened it, the girl realized that she couldn't find a better one. It showed all the streets, alleys, and buildings in the city with detailed names and numbers. When she arrived at the hotel restaurant, she ordered herself a cup of cappuccino. She didn't feel like eating, for everything inside trembled with excitement. She thought of Rob. He must be at work by now, or rushing off with his entourage for another treatment. She decided not to write him yet, so she studied the map. It turned out it was only a half-hour walk to the right house. The waiter brought coffee, but Emily couldn't take a sip. So much was her excitement. She got up from the table and stepped outside in relief. She was greeted by a beautiful, cool European morning. In all its festive splendor, she looked at the map. Apparently, she needed to first pass a mysterious place called Porto. Not to go a couple of blocks to cross the footbridge over the Moselle River. According to the map, it was a short walk to Luxembourg, which is no surprise here in Europe. All little Emily smiled at her thoughts. After walking a couple of streets, she found herself in front of an imposing masonry structure that resembled the burnt-out fortress of Porto. Not a game confirmed her hunch. The guidebooks did. Behind her stretched a huge shopping plaza with many stores and restaurants. At other times, Emily would have strolled through it, but not today. After passing a few more streets and a couple of shopping malls, she emerged onto a picturesque embankment, connected to the opposite bank by an ancient wide bridge. There were hills on the other side of the river, studded with villas and mansions, one of which her father lived in. Below the bridge was a large pier where boats and yachts were moored. The river flowed leisurely, as if in a dream. Near the edge of the shoreline, there was a bit of ice. Emily walked along the bridge at the same pace, for her heart was pounding. She felt as if she were about to lose her senses. At last, she was on the opposite bank of the river, and the cozy villas with high fences, behind which the skulls and roofs of the houses were barely visible, stretched out picturesquely before her. Emily had no trouble finding the right address. It was easy enough, for the Schwarzenegger residence was one of the most primitive in this little German Beverly Hills. In front of it was a massive framed stone fence, hidden behind the ivy, with an equally bulky cast iron gate flaunting itself in the middle. Behind them came back, Flying with You, and the park, slightly silvered by the morning frost. The climate in these parts was rather mild, and Emily noticed that some of the trees in town were already having buds. The old roofed house was beautiful, built in the late Baroque style. Even at this time of year, surrounded by a garden and ivy-filled flowers, it looked romantic and picturesque. She stood beside the gate and hesitated to ring the bell. This was where her father lived, her ancestors. This was probably where the lifelong love story that had brought her into the world began. A strange feeling gripped Emily. She wanted to cry and laugh at the same time. Fear of the unknown turned every nerve into taut strings. She noticed how she paved the gravel, the paths. A man showed up. He looked to be about 50-50. He was quite built with blonde hair. He had a dog with him, a little Yorkshire Terrier. Some kind of a hunch. Her sixth sense told her it wasn't just a servant walking a dog. He was wearing light-colored pants, a knit sweater, the color of white wool, and a striped scarf. He reminded the girl of Harry Potter, for on his nose sat glasses with round lenses. Emily felt her pulse clear, at least in half. She realized that it was most likely her father, Alex Schwarzenberg. The girl stood at the gate, unable to move, but he, meanwhile, noticed her and headed straight for the gate. The doggy took over beside him. He walked with confident, vigorous steps, not taking his eyes off his guest. Stopping just a meter away from her, he froze. His face, still young and beautiful, expressed a whole range of feelings of confusion, surprise, disbelief, and even fear. At that moment, Emily finally realized that her father was standing in front of her. It was as if she were looking in a mirror. He had the same facial features, the same straight nose, cheekbones, eye shape, even the shape of his lips. Only Alex Schwarzenberg was blonde, blue-eyed, and Emily inherited her dark hair and chocolate-colored eyes from her mother. "I can help you with something." "Unsure?" the man asked, keeping his eyes on her face as he prayed that his voice wouldn't tremble. Emily did ask, just in case. "I would like to see Mr. von Schwarzenberg. I have something to tell him." The man opened the gate and came out to meet her. "Alex von Schwarzenberg, let me introduce myself," and held out his hand to her. The girl carefully put her fingers in his palm. I beg your pardon, but who are you? He looked at her expectantly. I come from the USA. Emily said these words and noticed the change in his face. My name is Emily. He instantly went pale. Evidently, he remembered the name well, which had been her mother's and Emily's own name before her marriage. Please come in. He shunned and led her through the gate. They walked in silence all the way home. The dog ran beside her, oblivious to the guest, which is evidently what it is. The most aristocratic upbringing, when even dogs behave decently in the presence of strangers. They were met at the front door of the house by the Major, whom Alex ordered to organize a tea party and summon the Dowager Duchess Birgit. So she has a grandmother as well. At last they were in the hall. The splendor of the surroundings was blinding. Emily felt as if she were in one of the German museums, a country she had seen quite a few in her travels in the past. Antique chandeliers, tapestries, vintage furniture of expensive sorts, wood and silence. Deafening enough that Emily could hear her own heart pounding. Come, let's go into my office, invited Alex. They went into a richly furnished room, more like a library. For cabinets with books stood all around the room. Emily noticed that many of them had no names on the mugs, so they were very old. He gestured to the guest chair by the desk and sat across from her. So, are you related to Wendy? He said quietly, just like that, right in the forehead. Emily knew there was no turning back, so she nodded affirmatively. She's at peace here too. Was there such hope in his voice that she felt a bitter lump in her throat? Alas, she is not here. She died 2 years ago. Emily saw how his face twitched and whether his eyes were moist. And she was also my mother. So she said that. Alex stared at her with his eyes wide open. His hands, neatly folded on the table, nodded visibly. They were both silent. Emily saw tears run down his cheeks. The man was crying for her mother, for their faults, for their lives together, for their past, which quite obviously still remained in his memory, and she was grateful to him for that. He loved her. He waited for her. The girl suddenly realized that she was crying too. So they sat against each other, so similar in blood, but complete strangers. Emily didn't know how much time passed before he asked his question, "How old are you, Emily?" "I turned 30 on August 1. These words Emily whispered, for his voice overflowed with emotion, sat down to the limit. He had no trouble counting in his mind the thoughts, the experiences, the conclusions, the pain. It was all reflected on his face. He covered it with his hands, and the girl heard suppressed sobs. His shoulders implied, as they do for children who cannot calm down. Emily froze. She was suddenly scared. What was going to happen next? A knock on the office door brought him to his senses. He took up his chair and, wiping his cheeks with his palms, said loudly, "Come in." Gerd Schwarzenberg breakfast is already served in the dining room. Frau Birgit has also come down. She is waiting for you. Thank you, Peter. Tell him we'll be there in 10 minutes. Nodding, the servant bowed courteously and disappeared into the doorway. Alex looked at his guest. So, Emily, are you my daughter? Emily only lowered her eyes. She had heard the German restraint and was not expecting a warm embrace. However, Alex rose from his seat and walked around the huge solid oak desk and approached Emily. The girl rose towards him, and he, taking her in his hands, drew her to him and enclosed her in his arms, who found herself at his chest, where her heart was beating frantically. Emily suddenly felt at home. It was as if she was a little girl again, who dreamed of saying the word daddy for once, and now she was not alone. The girl was happy. What a pity Rod wasn't here. Then her happiness would have been complete. She hugged him, too, her father, who had not known about her for years. Why did her mother do that? Emily would never know that again. Finally, he pulled her away from his chest and looked her in the face. Of course, you look like me, girl. It's like looking in a mirror. My God, it's happiness. It's just unbelievable. I looked for Wendy for so many years, but I didn't know where she had moved from Philadelphia, where we first saw each other. I loved her more than life, but she left me. And 30 years later, you show up this miracle." He laughed through his tears, never letting go of his daughter's hand. "I have to give you something." Reluctantly, Emily spoke. After he managed to cope with our emotions, he looked at her questioningly, and she pulled out of her bag letters and a ring. When he saw the ring, Alex covered his mouth with his palm, as if he was afraid he was going to scream. He seemed about to lose his senses. "I gave this ring to my Wendy the last day we met. I asked her to marry me, and she said yes. But then she suddenly disappeared." He touched it with his hand, stroked the faceted stone, and it was as if he were carrying his thoughts back in time. She kept it. Then his gaze fell on the letters, and recognizing the handwriting, he began to read feverishly. After all 3 letters were read, Alex looked at Emily again. Tears were flowing down his face again. "I had lost the love of my life. I had almost come to terms with it, had learned to live without her. But fate had given me a special gift." He smiled now. "She gave me you. A daughter, my flesh and blood, born by the one who stole my heart forever. I found out by accident when I was going through my mother's things. I thought my father was dead. You must have been very lonely when she left." He looked at her with concern and compassion. "Yes, very much. And I was so anxious to find you, just to meet you, to talk to you. I don't need anything." He put his finger to his lips, and she froze half-heartedly. "Now we're going to go, and you're going to meet your grandmother, and then we're going to come back here, and we're going to talk for a long, long time. You will tell me all about your life, about yourself, about your mother." Emily nodded. By the time they were in the dining room, the girl had calmed down a little. Even though everything that was happening seemed to her like a fairy tale, a tricked-out consciousness of a magical dream, she understood that her life had changed forever. Her father believed her immediately and did not send her away unconditionally. She was not questioned in any way. The dining room of Princess von Schwarzenberg's residence was decked out in calm tones, bed-toned, light tapestries, and lightly antique furniture in the late Rococo style. Particularly impressed Emily, the lover, vintage and antique, gorgeous sideboard in white oak, golden case, and with other glassware in the sideboard, the finest Emily had ever seen. At the head of the enormous table, shot with the finest white tablecloth on which breakfast was set, sitting there was an old woman with perfectly white hair, folded in a cochlea at the back of her head, an oval face with thin lips, and a small, straight nose on which round glasses sat. She looked unhappy. "Good morning. Sorry to keep you waiting, Mom." Alex greeted his mother politely. "But I had more than good reason." And he, putting his hand on Emily's back gently, pushed her toward the table. Birgit replied nonchalantly with a sip of tea. She didn't think another tearful interview with a young journalist was more important than having breakfast with her mother on Christmas Eve. It was as if he let her words slip past his ears. "Allow me to introduce Emily Zakharov's mother. She just flew in yesterday from Philadelphia." At these words, the woman's face stretched and stiffened. Her hand with her cup of tea dropped noisily onto the table. Why did the enormous liquid spill and left stains on the white tablecloth? She takes a few seconds to comprehend what is happening. Then she asked the now familiar Emily question, "How old are you, girl?" She looked so arrogant that Emily slowly began to guess why her mother ran away from her happiness as well. "I am 30 years old," the old lady frantically fished for air. "So this is your daughter," she said, looking at her son. "It's not hard to guess, given that you have the same face. I knew this moment would come sooner or later." Alex looked stunned, first at Emily, then at his mother. "You knew?" She was silent, and he repeated the question. "Did you know Wendy was pregnant?" The old woman was drinking her tea again. Her chin treacherously trembled. She stared out the window, where the December sun poured gold on the paths of the park. "I knew," she answered, sobbing. Alex moved closer to the table and sat down next to her. Emily cautiously crouched in the chair at the very end. "You knew I was going to be a father, and you didn't say anything," he whispered. For a moment, Emily thought he was going to hit her, the look in his eyes so frightening. All these years of pining for Wendy, suffering in the company of an unloved wife, tormented by the fact that I have no heirs. "You knew I had a child." Birgit was silent, not looking at him. Her eyes glittered. "What did you do?" Her son grabbed her wrists. "What did you do?" "All I did was for you, for the family," she blurted out. "What did you say to Wendy? Did you make her leave me? Answer me." Then the old woman burst into tears. Yes, it was my fault that she left. I threatened her that I would never accept her into my family, that you would sooner or later realize what a mistake you had made, that society would never accept her or her child. I told her she wouldn't get a penny of our fortune. And then I offered her money to go away, but she wouldn't take it. God, how could you? Dumbfounded, looked at her Alex. "It's my blood, Schwarzenberg's blood after all." He nodded at Emily. "I was looking for them." Birgit blurted out, "I've been looking for years. When you divorced, I hired a private detective to find both Wendy and the baby. If he was born, I saw your anguish and regretted my action. But they weren't in Philadelphia. The string was cut in some provincial town where she was last seen. I wanted to make it right." She cried, waving her eyes with a handkerchief at Emily, who had lost her maternal grandmother. "Even as a child, I felt sorry for her." Alex sat with his head down on his arm. Emily became uncomfortable, for they were talking as if she were not here. She suddenly thought of the house, of the novel A. She suddenly, deeply. She sighed, which attracted the attention of both her father and Emily's grandmother. Alex muttered, "You can't even imagine. I'm so sorry. You have grown away from your family, from me and our roots and our history. We have so much catching up to do. I had a mother. Sadly," she said, "and she always loved and supported me, so I wasn't alone." He moved toward her and took her hands in his. "Now no one will ever keep us apart." He glanced meaningfully at her mother, who was sobbing silently over her cup of tea. "You will live here in your own home, which belongs to you by right. If you don't want it, you can choose any house you like, and we'll buy it." He looked at her with such enthusiasm and hope that Emily dared not object. "I really want to get to know you better. My daughter is my child." He brought his lips to her hands. The girl noticed that the old woman was furtively looking at them and smiling through her tears. Emily spent the whole day in the company of her father, who did not want to part with her for a moment. Her belongings were brought from the hotel and laid out by the maid in one of the magnificent Victorian bedrooms, which were found on the 3rd floor. She and Alex had a long conversation in the living room, telling each other about their lives, and he eagerly caught every word concerning Wendy. When Emily told him that she had never had another man, he cried. From time to time, Birgit joined them, but her son did not really welcome her appearance, and she withdrew under some pretext. In the evening, they went for a walk around the world, and the father showed Emily the famous Basilica of Constantine and the grandiose St. Peter's Cathedral, where festive services were being held. On the way, they repeatedly came across performers who smiled affably at all passers-by, and the girl even got into the spirit of a real Catholic Christmas. Once in the cathedral, Emily could not contain her admiration. A huge vaulted room with magnificent decoration of 1,000 candles, organ music, sarcophagi with relics of saints. Right in the stone floor were carved the names of bishops and cardinals. Buried here under slabs, polished young 1 million human feet. For several centuries, the cathedral had been full of people, and he and his father, unable to find a single vacant pew, stepped out again into the cold December air. Near the basilica, at a cozy outdoor cafe, Emily and Alex responded with a huge mulled wine and raw mozzarella balls and Christian cornflakes. Then we headed to the waterfront and took a long wander down the Moselle River to a pedestrian bridge into a respectable neighborhood of wealthy villas and mansions. "I got the best present this Christmas," with a smile said Alex, when they arrived at the gate of the princely residence. "I wish my happiness could never be complete without your mother. You must accept it and move on with your life, as I did." Emily shook his hand. He only nodded sadly, and they headed toward the house. In the dining room, as in the morning, Birgit was waiting for them. When they entered, she sat at the head of the table, stretched out like a string, and grudgingly pressed her already thin lips. Emily suddenly realized that she wasn't mad at her. She looked so guiltily unhappy that the girl, on a sudden impulse, went over to her and hugged her. Birgit jumped up in her chair in surprise and was taken aback. She looked at her son, who was as surprised as she was, and froze halfway to the table set for the festive dinner, expecting his left-handed mother to give an angry tirade about inappropriate behavior. The old woman gently dismissed her granddaughter and did not shed a tear. "Businesslike," she said, "since you were late for Christmas Eve, you don't have to change." Hearing these words, Duke Alex von Schwarzenberg laughed in relief. Christmas morning was overcast and rainy. Summer woke up on a giant bed in her now bedroom, covered by the covers of the common house. And first of all, I dialed Rob's number. Weird. After a few long beeps, short ones were heard. Obviously, he had dropped the call. Emily missed him so desperately that she wasn't even happy to be reunited with her father. She felt lost and alone. Several times during the day, Emily called him, and history repeated itself. Evelyn listened to her story without breathing and promised to find out what had happened to Rob. On December 31, a dinner party was scheduled, where Duke von Schwarzenberg planned to present his unexpected daughter to high society. On this occasion, tailors, stylists, reporters from local newspapers, and even one journalist from Berlin visited the house on the highway all day. Emily was deathly tired of such close attention to his person and evening. After dinner, they spent the evening alone with her father in the far drawing room, where the fireplace was blazing hot. This time she shared with him her dreams of professional fulfillment, which he accepted enthusiastically, suggesting that she set up her own business here in Germany. He spoke so enthusiastically about it, listened so attentively to her, that the girl felt ashamed that his plans were not destined to come true. After the new year, she would fly home to the USA, where there was a man for whose sake she would give up even the prospect of living here near her family. Maybe she'll tell Alex. Maybe he'll even understand her, because he, too, had a great love in his life. She holds nothing back. She told her father the long story of their relationship, reinforced by stories of his responsibility to his sick sister and how Emily's meeting with her father was due only to his efforts and connections. Alex listened with the utmost interest. "So this young man is very important in your life." He tilted his head to the side with a smile and looked adoringly at his daughter. Emily nodded, "And he must be very resentful of me." Why did the girl tell her father from the branch about the money she had left before she left? Oh, women. Alex said with a slight reproach. "How reckless you are in your good deeds. Of course he resents you, my dear." "And what am I to do?" Her voice trembled treacherously. "Run to him, of course. What about you? What about the reception?" He laughed. "But we'll have the reception on the morning of January 1. I'll arrange everything to Philadelphia. Just promise to come back to me." "I promise." "Daddy." Emily was so grateful to him that she didn't hold back and snuggled into her father's chest. He gently stroked her hair and added, "I will call a good friend of mine in Berlin. He is a professor of luminary medicine. We will try to help your lover's sister." "Thank you very much." "Thank you," hotly thanked the girl. A few minutes later, she was already climbing the stairs to her room with the intention of calling Evelyn right away. The uncertainty was killing Emily. She hadn't heard her voice in 2 days. Having checked in her bedroom, she immediately dialed her friend's number. "Hello," she heard a hoarse voice. "Evelyn, Emily, are you there?" "I'm a little confused, Emily. What's wrong with your voice?" It turned out that Evelyn had come down with a fever, never having had a chance to see Rob. Evelyn's calls are also being dropped by him. Wishing her friend a speedy recovery and disconnected, Emily dialed Jenna's number. The caller is out of range of the network, said nasty voice on the phone, that the only thing left to do is to bombard social media. What on earth was going on? Suddenly something was wrong. Emily was filled with wonderment. The 3 days before the appointment flew by quickly. To get to know her many uncles and children, to get to know her father and grandmother better, and to realize that her life would never be the same again. On the day of her appointment, Emily woke up with a terrible headache. She dreamt of Rob reaching out to her, sick Evelyn and Jenna in a jersey and hat in a hospital bed. On top of that, the phone was still silent. All her calls went unanswered, dangling her bare feet off the bed. Emily dialed Rob's number again. Silence again. She couldn't stand it any longer. No sooner had the girl put the phone away than the bell rang. It was Evelyn. "Hello." Emily answered in a husky voice. "Something has happened. Rob has been in an accident. I don't know anything myself, because I'm still lying in bed." Emily wouldn't listen to her. 15 minutes later, she was standing in the living room of her new house, suitcase in hand, explaining herself to her father. The house was already ready for her. Additional hired servants scurried back and forth with a tray and candelabra-type tablecloth and porter. The smells from the kitchen were terrific. She was so nervous her hands were shaking. Alex sat her down in a chair, poured her a glass of wine, and picked up her phone. About 20 minutes later, she had tickets booked for a direct flight Frankfurt, Philadelphia, and from Philadelphia to Rob's farm. She is scheduled to land at the East Airport at 10 p.m. sharp. The personal driver Duke von Schwarzenberg, an hour and a half before she starts from Trier to Frankfurt. And soon Emily was on her way to the USA. The day raced by in the same breath, and sitting in the cab that was taking her from Ulyanovsk Airport, Emily pondered the possibility that she might lose Rob. What was wrong with him? Are his injuries severe? None of this she knew. All she knew was the hospital he was in. Evelyn texted her. When Emily was still in the sky, falling off her feet from exertion and fatigue, Emily literally fell out of a Yandex cab outside the Central City Hospital. Dragging her suitcases behind her, she passed the emergency room, which for some reason was empty. From somewhere came the music and noise. The fun suddenly came to her. Today is December 31st, New Year's Eve. How could she have forgotten about it? Finally, from the lawsuit countless corridors of the emergency room, a girl in a white coat and handing her a €50 bill, Emily, being almost half hysterical, asked to escort her to Rob's room. What was in the trauma ward? A young nurse looked round her eyes at the crazy girl with the suitcase, demanding a date with the patient. But she took the money and walked Emily to the right room. Floor, I don't know. I'm sorry, but I can ask, timidly risked the girl. Emily nodded. Oh, it's almost 12 on New Year's Eve. The girl flustered and hurriedly retreated. Emily quickly proceeded into the ward, throwing her sister's suitcase. The hallway was quiet, and Emily, gathering her courage, prepared to knock on all the doors. She barely put her hand over the door of the first room. It opened, and Emily saw the light on her haggard face in surprise. She flinched so hard that she hurt the glass that carried the light. What happened? Emily heard Rob's faint voice. Emily quickly hugged the light, and without saying anything, burst into the room. The room was single and dark. Only a small boss burned on one bollard. On a high bed that stood in the center of the room lay a man, the most desirable in the world. His head and torso were wrapped in bandages. His left leg was hanging from the hood. He and Emily stared at each other in silence until the fireworks went off outside the windows. Happy New Year, Rob. She cautiously crouched on the edge of the bed and saw that there were tears glistening in his eyes. Happy New Year, Emily, he smiled. You came. What did you think? Through her tears, she laughed. That I would trade you for a foreign prince. He was guilty and silent. My God, what a fool you are. Rob is simply impenetrable. She brought her face close to his. Their lips met at that moment. Emily realized how much she needed him, like air, like light. She had loved him all her life, hiding, running away from her feelings, wasting precious time with the wrong person and the wrong people. She would not make such a mistake again. Rob embraced her gently but powerfully, as if he wanted to show her that he would never let her go anywhere again. "Sweetheart," I was so bored by the door. Looking at them, Jenna stood and cried with happiness. They welcomed spring in Berlin, where Jenna was undergoing immune therapy. Her vitals improved, and the attending physician Emily told them about. Alex soon informed them that the disease had gone into remission. Back in Trier, Emily became more and more attached to her new relatives, who turned out to be crazy about Rob. At the end of March, they were already cuddling at the airport with Jenna, who had come to their engagement party. It was warm and sunny. Nature was waking up from her winter slumber and pleased the eyes with fresh greenery, parks, and squares. In the waiting room, Emily and Rob were holding hands when they saw a familiar figure in the crowd. Taking the huge suitcase from her hands, Rob began to walk through the crowd of greeters and arrivals, and the girls, embracing, followed him. "Do you know who I saw the other day at the women's clinic? Your ex-boyfriend," she whispered in Emily's ear. "He brought his receptionist to the ultrasound, and they were arguing right in front of the office because she got the accents wrong. Come to think of it, I said hello, of course, and glimpsed that you had found your German Duke father. You should have seen the look on your future daddy's face that would have stretched." Emily laughed. "Would your face be stretching now?" "Come on," Evelyn squinted his left eye. "You're going to be an auntie and godmother soon enough." "My mother's woman," Evelyn gusted, hugged her friend, and tears spurted from her eyes. Emily, wow. "I'm so happy for you. Hey, what's with the flood?" Rob came over to them and put his arm around both their shoulders. "It's okay, yeah," Emily whispered as she snuggled into his shoulder. "It's definitely okay now." Subscribe and click the bell.
Betty looked out of the cab window at the cityscapes running by and smiled. She was on her way home from the airport, her business trip unexpectedly postponed. The chief had called her boss, with whom Betty was already preparing to go through passport control, and informed her that there was no need to fly anywhere today. "Let's go home," Clara, the chief accountant of their company, ordered. "Today we rest. Tomorrow I'll see you at the office." Betty couldn't believe her sudden good fortune. A whole free day, and Mason, just at home, took a vacation for a week, and daughter Molly flew with her parents to Miami. Finally, she and her husband would have some alone time. They needed it so badly. After all, lately both of them catastrophically do not have enough time for each other. But before it was different. Compliments, admiring glances, walks, romantic acts, surprises without reason, and talk about everything in the world. When did it change? With the birth of her daughter, or with Betty's going to work after a prolonged maternity leave? The woman couldn't remember the exact moment when Mason began to drift apart. It seemed to have been going on for about 3 years. Betty missed her spouse's jokes, attention, and care. She sincerely missed her formerly loving husband. The mere sight of him made a woman feel loved and attracted. Of course, Betty understood. Mason has a serious job. He often has to fly to Boston, where their company opened a large branch 4 years ago. He practically lives there, sometimes staying for weeks at a time, tired. It's understandable that he doesn't have time for romance. No, Mason honestly fulfilled all the duties of a husband and father, provided their family with everything they needed, spent his free time with his daughter, never gave up household chores. Yet Betty realized it was time for a change. She wanted that warmth back. This free day to spend alone with her husband was just the right thing to do. It would be good for their relationship, as if fate itself were helping them. Betty quietly opened the door with her key. She wanted the effect of surprise, to see her husband's surprised and delighted face. She tiptoed into the hallway. From their bedroom came Mason's quiet voice. He was on the phone, probably being disturbed from work again. He often received calls and texts, even at night, and on weekends or holidays, he could easily be called to the office or to the site. What can you do? He was an important person in a large construction company. But the paycheck was right. Betty was not the kind of wife who threw tantrums at her busy husband, demanding attention. She understood that her husband was trying for the sake of their family, even felt sorry for him, and was grateful to him for this work, and was proud of such a busy and irreplaceable husband. And now the woman did not interfere with Mason, lurked at the front door and decided to let him finish his conversation and then discover his arrival. But her husband's tone was strange, clearly non-businesslike. Betty involuntarily listened to the words. "Sweetheart, but I'll make a deal. They'll give you a few days of rest, come." Why would I pass up a chance like that? "Don't worry, I'll take care of everything. I'll buy you tickets, of course, but when else will it happen that my wife will go on a business trip for a week? She rarely goes on business trips, and then there's my daughter at the sea. Jenna, you wanted to see the Capitol. I'll give you a tour." Betty couldn't believe her ears. Is this really happening to her? Her husband is now cooing with some lady and even calling her over to their place while his wife is away on business. Mason has a mistress. Betty really wanted to explain the overheard conversation to herself in a different way, but her imagination was clearly lacking for a different version. And what else could she do to justify all this? Sunshine. "Come here. My wife's on a business trip." Mason almost cooed into the phone, speaking tenderly and affectionately. He hasn't spoken to his wife like that in a long time. Apparently, the unfamiliar Jenna had decided to come to New York after all. That's great. Mason was sincerely happy. "I'll meet you at the airport. I have such plans. We'll have a great time." Yeah, whatever you want." "Oh, you're so beautiful. I'm looking forward to it, too." The conversation seemed to be coming to an end. Betty crept back to the door on shaky legs and slipped out onto the landing. She decided not to show Mason that she had heard him on the phone with someone named Jenna, a beauty by the looks of it. At least that's what he called her. Yes, Betty had no doubts about the superior looks of Mason's date. Her husband had always been an aesthete. The woman entered the apartment a second time. Now she purposely slammed the door loudly, signaling her presence. Mason stepped out into the hallway. Betty watched carefully as the confusion, surprise, and disappointment in his eyes was gradually replaced by amazed joy. Her husband had always been excellent at self-control. Now he quickly pulled himself together. If Betty had not heard this conversation, she would not have noticed that her arrival was not a happy news for her husband. "You're back," he smiled broadly. Mason was good at hiding his frustration at the lurking plans. "What kind of actor?" "Rescheduled a business trip," Betty replied. Her heart was pounding furiously, and her head was starting to hurt. "Were you upset about it?" Mason asked. "You're just not wearing your face. I felt sick in the cab." Betty lied. "I want to lie down." She went to the bedroom and, without undressing, fell in their big bed, trying not to think about the fact that perhaps her husband was planning to invite his mistress here. How could this be? They had been through so much together, had traveled so long and hard to build their prosperous, happy family, and had overcome all the difficulties together, shoulder to shoulder, always supporting each other, so many small and big victories behind them. Periodically, Betty would learn that the husband of one of her colleagues or friends had a mistress. Outraged and certain that it would definitely never happen in her family. And now this conversation. Her head ached, growing increasingly nauseous. Mason, seeing his wife lying pale and in a state of flux, was alarmed and brought her painkillers and a cold compress to her forehead. Had it not been for the overheard conversation, Betty would now be glad of such care. But then she wouldn't have been sick, either, because she'd been overexcited and her blood pressure had skyrocketed. Pressing her fingers to her temples so that the headache was easier to bear, Betty thought back to her and Mason's acquaintance. It had been a fun, carefree college time. The girl was relaxing in a club, in the company of classmates. There she had been noticed by him, a charming fellow with a wide, white-toothed smile, witty and cheerful, who could dance, unlike Betty herself. What a handsome boy! Kelly remarked, a childhood friend. Lucky you, don't miss out. And Betty? Yes, Mason was a prince, but right now she just wanted to have fun with her friends. She had no plans for romance, much less a serious relationship. Only recently Betty had hardly got rid of her ex-boyfriend, obsessive and constantly demanding attention. And now the girl was enjoying her freedom. The admiration in Mason's eyes was pleasing to Betty's ego. She liked his compliments and touches. He obviously hoped to continue communication outside the club, even took Betty's phone number. However, she had changed some numbers on purpose, as she often did. The girl did not plan a second meeting, so she tried to enjoy communication with a handsome guy here and now. And then their student company decided to go to another club, closer to the house where Betty lived. The girl said goodbye to her new acquaintance, who was upset by this news. Mason then gently took her narrow palm in his, kissed her hand gallantly, and said, "I'll call you back. I really liked you. You're so beautiful, so special. I won't let you go." Betty smiled. She felt like a real princess at that moment. The girl was always popular with the opposite sex. She had what is called a model appearance. Tall, slender, long-legged, her shiny brown hair falling below her shoulders, and emerald green eyes, regularly received admiring glances and compliments, and each time it was very gratifying. As she did now, Betty smiled sweetly at Mason, whom she thought she would never meet again. And she got into the overcrowded car of her classmates, where her friends were already waiting for her. The merry company drove through the night streets of her hometown for a long time. The students laughed, sang their favorite songs, made plans for the approaching summer, and Betty, to her surprise, couldn't stop thinking about Mason. It wasn't the first time she'd given a guy the wrong phone number, only now she regretted it for some reason. And she felt guilty about lying to her new acquaintance. The first person Betty saw when they pulled up to the club was Mason. It turned out he had taken a cab and followed their car and was now walking toward her smiling and open arms. The girl hurried toward the guy with joy and relief. How lucky was it that he had guessed to do this? She was afraid they would never meet again. With Mason, Betty had always been fun. He knew exactly how to cheer her up and make her laugh. Next to him, she felt safe from everything in the world and very loved. She realized that if she needed him, Mason would do everything possible and impossible for her. And it was very pleasant. And Mason had somehow gained authority among Betty's friends, which was very important to her. And this could not but make the girl proud of her for such a witty and communicative young man. He, like Betty, was a student, a third-year student, but he was studying at another university, an architectural and construction university, and was already working part-time for a friend of his father's. Betty, on the other hand, was fully immersed in her studies. Her parents offered her to enter the University of Economics to study accounting. The girl didn't mind. By the end of the 11th grade, she had no special preferences. An accountant, so an accountant. Vacancies will not be difficult to find later. Accountants are required everywhere. But Mason really loved everything about architecture and could talk about his work for hours. Betty loved to listen to his stories and look into the enthusiastic eyes of her favorite person. She had no doubt Mason would be a great success in life. In their 4th year, the couple decided to consummate their relationship. They were sure of their feelings for each other. "I've found my destiny. It's you," said Mason one day. "I want to be with you all the time, not date you a few times a week. I want to fall asleep and wake up next to you. So what if we're still students? I don't want to wait too long to get married." Betty was happy, smiling. She felt the same way. The prospect of becoming Mason's wife and always being by his side was breathtaking. But parents on both sides actively opposed the ideas of the young ones, motivated by quite logical facts. Both are still studying. On their feet did not become, there is nowhere to live. Where to hurry? Meet and get married later, when you've finished your studies and found a job. And then Betty thought of telling her parents that she was expecting a child. So her mom and dad and her future mother-in-law quickly organized a wedding. "That's a lie, of course," said Mason. "But what can you do if they need a good reason?" "It's their own fault," agreed Betty. "Well, what if it's true? What if we really have a baby?" Mason suggested, "I really want us to have a baby. I'm already working. We'll live in my grandmother's empty apartment. I'll finish university. I'll be made the head of the department at once. The chief has already promised me a place, so I'll feed us." "That's a great idea." Betty was happy. She suddenly realized that she really wanted a child from the man she loved. It would be the happiest and most beautiful baby in the world. But for some reason, the attempts of the young ones were not successful. The cherished pregnancy did not come. True, then this young married couple did not particularly care. And without that in life was a lot of interesting parties, friends, studies, traveling. When the newlyweds admitted to their parents that there was no child, they didn't even get angry. By that time, adults sincerely loved the second halves of their children and considered their decision to get married a correct and responsible step. They only laughed at the ingenuity of Betty and Mason and hoped that they would not delay their grandchildren. And then, finally, the diploma. Betty and her husband are now young professionals. Mason, as promised, was promoted to department head. Betty got a job as a bookkeeper at the mall. Now they were making their own money for a living. Not much, of course, yet, but their parents continued to help out as a matter of habit. So they had enough not only for food and utilities, but also for fun. "How good you are!" Callie, Betty's friend, admired her. "You've done so well in life." "I don't believe in fairy tales about early marriages falling apart, but I've been dumped by a guy again, and all I get are assholes." Betty sincerely pitied the woman who had failed in her personal life and thanked fate for sending her such a faithful, loving, reliable man as Mason. Her friends and coworkers were constantly complaining about their boyfriends and husbands. During these conversations, Betty felt a little awkward. She couldn't keep the conversation going, for she had nothing to reproach Mason with. Time passed. The newlyweds gradually managed to establish a household. Mason and Betty were homeschooled children, cared for by their parents, so household chores were a challenge for both of them at first. It turned out that Betty's long hair quickly clogs the drain, dishes do not wash themselves, dust in the corners accumulates incredibly quickly, and regularly ordered food in the restaurant hurts the family budget. The newlyweds were in for many such surprises. It got to the point that Betty, going to prepare dinner, typed in a search engine phrase, "Where can I get red water for borscht?" The couple withstood the test of everyday life with dignity. Both quickly enough learned to cook and clean, and even made repairs independently in the apartment. Their marriage was waiting for another test of durability. They were married for 5 years, and the family still had no children. Even Kelly managed to give birth to a son. However, she raised her Ethan alone now. His father considered himself too young for such responsibility and disappeared in an unknown direction. But Betty was still almost envious of her friend, looking at her miracle, a tiny cute little baby boy, and desperately dreamed of her own baby. Mason, too, was eager to be a father. The hospitalizations began. Betty was diagnosed with serious reproductive problems. Medications, ultrasounds, tests, treatments. All this exhausts both mentally and physically, but for the sake of her dream, the girl did not give up. Mason was by her side and supported her spouse in everything. Probably, this is our punishment for lying to our parents then, as if we were expecting a child. Betty sighed sorrowfully, looking at another negative pregnancy test. Come on, we meant well, and we didn't do anything wrong. And don't get upset. Everything will work out. But it didn't. When all possible treatments had been tried, the doctor recommended echo. Betty and Mason were sure they would soon be parents. But 3 tries and no success. Betty lay on the bed and just stared at the ceiling. There was no more strength left to cry. She realized she was never going to be a mother. It was all useless, and she didn't want to torture her own body, to hope again and then be disappointed. And then Mason came up. Shall we try again? He said. Only once. I read the forums. Some people only get it on the 8th, 9th try. We're on our 4th. Let's do it. 4th try, and that's it. If we fail again, we'll take a kid from the orphanage. Do you agree? Betty jumped up on the bed. She once suggested her husband to look at orphan profiles, but he flatly refused. He wanted a child of his own blood. He didn't want to raise a stranger's son or daughter, but Betty didn't care. She dreamed of giving love and warmth to a tiny, defenseless human being, even if not born by her. This desire overshadowed all others, filled the woman's thoughts. Mason remained adamant. He argued about bad genetics, the difficulties of adaptation. He didn't want another man's child, and he had every right to. Betty accepted his opinion. So her husband offers to take the baby from the orphanage, but before that he asks for another chance at a native hair. Of course, this time Betty happily agreed to the echo. She was going to the procedure in a completely different mood. One way or another, soon her cherished dream will come true. She will become a mother. It is not known what played a major role, the new therapy or Betty's positive attitude. But it wasn't until this 4th time that everything worked out. Betty looked at the 2-strike test and cried with happiness. And soon Mason joined her. The pregnancy was difficult. Betty was often hospitalized. Mason completely took over the household and almost blew the dust off his wife. He honored her every request, anticipated her every wish, even asked her to quit her job. You don't need to go there now. Nerves unnecessary waste. Rest better, have a baby, grow up a little, and find you a new job. My salary is enough for everything, and next year I'll be promoted. Betty happily plunged into the life of a housewife. A beloved, loving husband, a cozy new apartment, and soon there will be a baby. What more do you need to be happy? Oh, Betty, you are a clever woman. You have organized your life so well. My friend Kelly, who often came to visit, said approvingly. Not like me, a single mother who is torn between work and my son. Ethan was already in 1st grade. Kelly did look tired, thin, anxious, always in a hurry. There's a reason I told you at the club. Don't let him get away. He's a great guy. Remember what I said? I do. Betty agreed. She texted Mason the wrong phone number that night, And if he hadn't followed them to the club, none of this would be happening now. It's scary to imagine. And then Molly was born. There was no limit to the happiness of the young parents and the newfound grandparents. Now their family became even stronger and happier. True, Betty, after a long treatment, difficult pregnancy, and childbirth, began to have problems with blood pressure. She often felt ill. Mason in these moments perfectly coped with the baby, bathed his daughter, fed her from a bottle, entertained the baby, even swaddled the newborn. And he was just as good at it as Betty. Molly grew up bright and active, but very sickly. She often caught colds and bronchitis in the garden, so Betty had to delay going to work. The maternity leave dragged on until her daughter was 5, and then Kelly invited her best friend to her firm. There was just a vacancy, so the women became colleagues. Life fell into place. Molly was already a first grader. Betty worked. Mason became the head of a large branch of his company, which was located in Boston. There were no money problems. Her husband provided for the family. Betty thought their relationship was perfect. Yes, there wasn't much romance anymore. Sometimes it was very lacking. But after all, they had been together for so many years, it was normal. The main thing was trust, reliability, mutual support. And now this conversation. Betty felt like she couldn't handle the pressure. It seemed to her that these health problems were in the past. Then after giving birth, Mason found the best doctors for her. The new mom got the right therapy, and she forgot about the headaches for years. But now such stress and they're back. By evening, Mason couldn't take it anymore and called his wife an ambulance. She was diagnosed with hypertension and taken to the hospital. She had to lie down for about a week. During that time, the woman pulled herself together. She has no right to beat herself up like that. She has a small daughter and a beloved husband. Yes, he made a mistake, but Betty doesn't know the situation. Maybe it's Jenna, the unknown Jenna, who has tricked him around. Betty is not going to give up just like that. She's been building her strong, happy family for a long time. She and Mason have done everything possible and impossible together. And now she's gonna give her husband to some skank? No way! That's the last thing we need. Molly needs a father. She needs a reliable, caring husband. Betty will fight for her family. This decision gave the woman strength and vigor. There was plenty of time at the hospital to get busy searching for the beautiful stranger. Betty only knew her name so far, but in the age of social media, that was enough. First of all, the woman set about monitoring her husband's accounts. Mason had a lot of friends and subscribers, colleagues, friends, partners, just acquaintances. Jenna among them was enough. Betty rejected ladies of age immediately. Then it was the turn of women who did not reach the aesthetic tastes of her husband. Mason always preferred beautiful, slender, well-groomed girls like Betty herself. The remaining Jenna beauties from her husband's pages were 3. These young women didn't look too suspicious, all of them showing off their own happy families on social media. Their profiles were littered with photos of their other halves. Who knows who they are, though? It's not a fact that Mason's mistress is single. How many cases when married ladies decide to have a little fun and make a friend on the side? And yet Betty's intuition told her that Jenna wasn't one of them. Suddenly, the search engine gave Betty several accounts with a note. Perhaps you two know each other. Among them was Liam, a colleague of Mason's from the Boston branch. In the main profile photo, he was clearly posing from a corporate event, with their company logo in the background. Betty was interested. Her husband had never shown her pictures from the parties he'd flown to Boston for. He said he wasn't interested in collecting that garbage, and he hated being photographed. and now Betty wanted to see how their corporate holidays were going. If Liam had put a photo from the party on the cover, he'd probably have a couple more on his profile. Betty went to the page of her husband's colleague, and as she expected, he had a whole album of photos from corporate parties. The woman started flipping through the photos with interest. She noticed her husband in some of them. He seemed to be deliberately hiding from the cameras, and the photographer managed to capture only a glimpse of him, in a half-turn or from the back. Betty smiled. Mason hadn't liked to be photographed since he was a child. His mother had told me a funny story about it, but it wasn't long before the woman wasn't laughing. The next photo featured the three of them, Liam, Mason, and a beautiful, bright young woman with chiseled facial features. Betty's husband stood in the center. The lady was clinging to him in an overly possessive way, and he was naturally and habitually putting his arm around her slim waist. Something wasn't right here. Betty shifted her eyes downward. Each of the characters in the photos were labeled Mason and Jenna. Jenna. Betty seemed to have accidentally stumbled upon the one she was looking for. The woman quickly navigated to the girl's page. There were many pictures of her. The beauty clearly loved being photographed. You bet, with such appearance, just a supermodel. Jenna at a resort. Jenna in a luxurious restaurant. Jenna in the pool, and everywhere alone. How could a hottie like Jenna be alone? She can't be. I bet she's got a lot of dates. And suddenly Betty saw a picture from the sea. It was obviously some foreign resort. White sand, bright sunshine, palm trees, turquoise waves. Jenna was photographing the beautiful landscape. In the frame, apparently, accidentally got a man. He stood with his back to the lens. But Betty recognized her husband, his figure, the birthmark on his neck, and the t-shirt that she herself gave him. There was no doubt. This was the same Jenna her husband had called to New York for her business trip. The same mistress. And they're serious. They're even traveling to the sea together. Mason must have explained those trips to her as business trips, of which he'd had too many lately. Well, at least now Betty knows the enemy. Jenna was in her final year of university when she met Mason. It happened in a bar where she and a classmate were celebrating the end of the session. A handsome young man in an expensive business suit was relaxing at a neighboring table with a few friends, or rather colleagues. Those two were dressed in strict jackets and pants. Businessmen, probably. Christina, Jenna's dorm roommate and classmate, looked at them. They're all so cool. Come on, they're old for us, and they're probably married. Just let me dream. So cool, well-groomed, not like our guys. Continued to admire Christina. Having a couple of glasses of wine, she always became kinder to the opposite sex. Every man seemed to her almost a prince on a white horse. But the men in this nearby company did look attractive. Stylish, trim, handsome. One of them stood out in particular, gray-eyed, with a wide, white-toothed smile that made dimples appear on his cheeks. Jenna tried not to look in his direction. Look, they're looking at us, Christina said admiringly. Of course, you yourself do not take your eyes off them. So they look at you and are surprised. Calm down. Jenna, they are coming to us. Indeed, soon one of the men, not the one Jenna liked, came to their table. He introduced himself as Liam and asked Christina to dance with him. She gladly agreed. Jenna finished her cocktail and watched the dancing of her friend, who, apparently, decided to get closer to the beau by all means. But another man, the oldest of the group, with an expensive watch on his arm and stylish glasses, separated from the table. Good evening. He introduced himself, taking a seat next to Jenna. What is it that such a beautiful girl is sad here alone? What a banal approach. From the representative of the older generation, Jenna expected something original. I'm not sad about being alone. I'm enjoying it. The girl not too subtly hinted at being left alone, but the newfound admirer did not give up. My name is James. He introduced himself. I just can't resist your beauty. You look like a young Nicole Kidman. Has anyone ever told you that? More than once. Can I ask you your name? No, you don't have to say no so flatly. You just don't realize you're missing out on a great opportunity I could give you. Give me some peace for starters. Jenna was getting annoyed. That Christina, she is there on the dance floor with her handsome man, and she has to fight off an obsessive suitor who does not understand neither hints nor direct refusals. James, meanwhile, had moved closer to Jenna, and he was drunk. That partly explained his lack of judgment. Surely in ordinary life, this man is tactful and intelligent. Some people shouldn't drink at all. They turn into such animals. James put his hand on the back of Jenna's chair and looked at the girl with admiring eyes. It was unpleasant. She stood up, intending to leave, but the man held her hand, his palm firmly around her wrist. Where are you going? We haven't even met yet. I have to go. I'll walk you out. James jumped up from his seat. He never let go of my hand. Let me go already. Jenna shouted loudly. He didn't think to loosen his grip. Perhaps he couldn't hear or understand what he was saying, the cocktails playing no small part in his behavior. James, instead of letting go of Jenna, suddenly hugged her. It was too much. The girl moved as hard as she could at the insolent man, her elbow right into his soft belly, and he awed and opened his arms for a moment. The man's eyes flashed with malice. It frightened the girl. Anything could be expected from a drunken stranger. She tried to slip away, but he grabbed her again. This time roughly and very tightly. Jenna felt pain. We need to talk. Sit down. James asked. James, what are you doing? Calm down. The gray-eyed man approached them. Fortunately, he noticed what was going on at the table and rushed to help, either to rescue his friend from possible trouble or to protect the girl. For some reason, Jenna immediately felt safe and realized that everything was going to work out. Why would she? James' speech became more and more incoherent. Two other men from the company came up to them and took the clueless comrade to their table. You excuse him. The gray-eyed one smiled. I had a little too much to drink, and today the deal was closed, so here's a note. Thank you, replied Jenna. She couldn't take her eyes off the man's beautiful, intelligent eyes. The girl just drowned in them. He looked even more attractive up close than he looked from afar. For some reason, she wanted to run her hand over his cheeks, touched with light stubble. That had never happened to her before. Jenna painfully invented an excuse to prolong communication with the gray-eyed man. She did not want to part with him. Fate had taken pity on her, and everything had worked itself out. And Mason, Liam and Christina, who had been dancing, came to the table. Come on, land here. Look how cool the girls are. Christina laughed foolishly with adoration, looking at her beau. Mason stayed at the table, and Jenna realized it was because of her. A hot wave ran through her whole body. She was drawn to Mason more and more, like a magnet pulling her. Mason was a very interesting and witty conversationalist. He seemed to be able to hold a conversation on any topic, and Jenna wanted to agree with his opinions every time. She wished the evening would never end. It was unlikely that she would ever meet this man who had such a strange influence on her again. From the table conversations, the girl realized that he lives and works in Boston and came here on a business trip. Mason, to Jenna's disappointment, did not even try to get her phone number. Most likely he is married, and he does not need a relationship on the side. Yes, the girl felt that she liked Mason, and it was very pleasant, but he behaved as restrained as possible, not showing his sympathy in any way. Jenna hoped that she did not give away her sudden feelings either. Until now, she hadn't understood what passion, love, and other concepts from romantic books and movies meant. It seemed to her that all of these were fictitious categories, that they didn't really exist, but now she was in a whirlpool of feelings, and she had no idea what to do with it all. The evening was rapidly drawing to a close. The bar closes at 200 hours. Christina and Liam decided to take a cab and go for a walk. They called Masana and Jenna, but the man refused at once, saying that he had an important meeting in the afternoon. Jenna thought of some reason not to go with the couple. When Christina and Liam drove off into the night, Mason offered to walk Jenna home. Her heart raced. Was what had been dreamed of all evening really happening? She'd really hit it off, and they'd start a relationship. Without witnesses, he would finally dare to take a step towards her. His heart fluttered in joyful anticipation. In the cab, the girl waited for Mason to kiss her, or at least to embrace her, but he again behaved a little aloofly, though he joked and smiled a lot. And already on the porch of the student dormitory, he took Jenna's phone number. She gladly dictated the numbers to him and realized that from that moment, she would live in anticipation of a call. It didn't take long to wait. Mason called the very next day, invited to the movie. After the movie, they walked along the waterfront, then stopped by a luxurious restaurant. Jenna had been living in Boston for 5 years, but she had no idea that there were such places here. She felt a little uncomfortable, but Mason helped her relax, just covered her hand with his palm, and all the anxiety, worry, awkwardness disappeared as if it had never happened. Then he offered to go to his place. Of course, Jenna knew what that meant, and Mason realized that she knew what she was getting into, so he didn't insist, gave her the right to choose. Jenna agreed without the slightest hesitation. The corporate apartment was as upscale and presentable as Mason himself, stylish, bright, spacious, modern, and clearly designed by a designer. Jenna didn't realize whether the company had bought the apartment for Mason or whether it was just renting it to an employee, because the latter was often in Boston. That's how they started dating. That first night, the couple was cozy on the couch in the living room. Mason suggested Jenna not to go to the hostel at night, but to stay with him. The girl gladly accepted the invitation. She did not want to part with Mason. And here they were watching some show on TV and eating rolls ordered from the restaurant, drinking insanely delicious champagne. Finally, the girl decided on an important question, which did not give her a rest. "And you, were you married?" she asked. "Yes, does it matter?" Jenna thought for a moment. On the one hand, it really didn't matter. She feels happy around Mason. She wants to see the face and smell the smell of the man she loves, to feel his touch and bathe in his admiration and care, and to be a part of his beautiful life. Yes, Jenna wasn't lying to herself. She liked that Mason was so successful and wealthy, but that wasn't the only thing that attracted her to him. Far from it. And the wife, she was somewhere far away, New York. What did it matter if she even existed or not? On the other hand, Jenna realized that it is not good to have an affair with a married man. It is always a betrayal, and the outcome is often sad, even tragic sometimes. The girl herself many times lectured her friend Christina when she was too fond of unfree men. And yet, still Mason attracted Jenna, charmed, mesmerized. For the sake of being near him, she was ready to go over all her principles and moral turmoil. After all, Jenna is not going to take him out of the family, at least not until she is enough to feel, at least sometimes as a woman, this strong, confident, and intelligent man. Mason has shown Jenna a very different life. The girl came to Boston to study from the village, and it took a long time to get used to the city. There was a time when she was even shy to go with her classmates to cheap cafes and eateries. In her village, she did not see anything like that. Such places seemed to her too luxurious. She felt in them some lost and ridiculous. Gradually, Jenna settled in Boston. It was easier and more fun to adapt with her roommate, Christina, a country girl like her. Looking at other students and following their advice, Jenna learned to dress and make up so as to favorably emphasize the advantages of her appearance. And movie halls, cafes, and bars soon stopped scaring her. Boys, students, and even teachers began to pay attention to Jenna. The girl realized the power of her beauty, but was not in a hurry to use it to the fullest, not like Christina, who seemed to try to take from her freshness and youth all at once. Jenna, however, having seen different stories in her village and in the city too, had made up her mind. First she would study, get on her feet, and then she would organize her personal life, surely with a worthy and successful man. They will have a wonderful family, a perfect one. Jenna will never again live in the poverty of her childhood, and she will not return to her village. On the contrary, she will bring her mother and brother here. The girl had global plans, and she confidently went to the goal. She studied at her pedagogical university, but she did not plan to work as a teacher of biology and geography. She thought that after graduation, she would find something more prestigious and highly paid. Entering this department right after school, the girl did not think much about the prospects. She went to the place where she had enough points, and the competition was small. And now Mason appeared in her life, and with him, trips to restaurants, luxurious gifts, long conversations on interesting topics, vivid impressions, new acquaintances. Not even 2 months after the beginning of their relationship, as Mason offered Jenna to fly with him for a few days to Thailand. The girl with pleasure plunged into this beautiful sea fairy tale. Later such trips became quite frequent. Mason could easily explain his absence to the family by business trips and business trips. Jenna, on the other hand, tried not to think about the fact that her man had another life, a wife and a daughter in New York. Of course, she almost immediately looked through her lover's social networks and saw pictures of his wife. Beautiful, successful woman, quite harmoniously looked in a pair with imposing Mason. Together they looked just perfect. Jenna could not help but recognize this fact, although it hurt her. The girl didn't plan to fall in love with Mason, or anyone at all. She had other goals for now, but she couldn't help it. Even yesterday, Jenna was an ordinary student who often had to eat instant noodles for dinner, even with Christina sometimes sharing this treat. She counted a small scholarship and saved on everything, and today she knew by sight the staff of the most elite establishments in Boston. She herself now lived in the very Mason corporate apartment that had so delighted her, in a stylish studio, packed to the brim with tricked-out appliances, with a spacious bathtub. Jenna liked to lie in it with a flute of cold champagne, like the girls in the movies about the beautiful life. Mason flew to Boston every month, sometimes more than once. It was required by work issues, but Jenna suspected that his business trips became so frequent because of her too. The girl realized that Mason really took her very seriously, not as just another mistress. And he wasn't the type to change women like a glove. Jenna knew that this was Mason's first and only relationship on the side, and she could see that the man was very uncomfortable with the fact that he had to lie to his wife, but he couldn't give up on Jenna. When the girl graduated from the university, Mason got her a job in his branch in the Human Resources Department. Jenna had to learn a lot practically from scratch to master a new specialty, but she coped, and she liked the work very much. And the salary, almost every month coming with a solid bonus, and quite happy. The girl realized that without experience, right from the university bench, she would never have found a place with such a salary if not for Mason, and she was grateful to him for the opportunity to get on her feet. It was very important to her. Time passed in the company. Some of the employees, of course, began to speculate about the relationship between the branch manager and Jenna. They talked and got used to it. The girl cared little about it, but she realized that sooner or later some well-wisher would report everything to Mason's wife. And what would happen then? It was difficult to suppose, yet years passed, but everything remained the same. Perhaps the 1,000 miles separating New York and Betty was released from the hospital. She was now completely well, both physically and mentally. She realized that she would fight for the man she loved and for her family. This decision gave her strength and confidence, but Betty needed allies, no one but her faithful friend Kelly to tell her the details of the story. "What a mess," Kelly said thoughtfully after listening to Betty. The women were sitting in a coffee shop, not far from the office. It was the only place to get away from the ears of their co-workers. "Yes, these are pies. I never would have thought that about Mason, the perfect husband and father from the outside. The weird thing is, he's a really great husband and father. They've been together for 4 years, and I had no idea. With his schedule, it's no wonder, constantly on the road, it's easy to hide not just a mistress, but a second family. Well, what have you decided? How will you proceed?" "Fight for my husband," Betty replied confidently. "I want Mason to realize that I am worth more to him than he is, and that no young beauty is worth losing his family. I'd like to do it without Mason realizing that I know about his relationship." "So you don't have a specific plan?" Kelly clarified. "What kind of plan? I don't have a lot of information. I only know her name and that she works at the Boston branch, which is probably where Mason put her. But I've seen pictures of her, and she's very pretty. So we need more information." Kelly concluded. Betty really liked it, us. She realized she now had a solid support in the person of her best friend. "We do." Betty agreed, but where would she get that information? "I don't know any of Mason's colleagues in Boston. I can't even ask them. I have an idea." Kelly suddenly had an idea. "Really, what is it?" "Wait, I don't want to get your hopes up yet. I'll call you tonight." And her friend kept her promise. Indeed, called in the evening and outlined her simple, like all things brilliant plan. Kelly's brother had a friend who was an IT specialist. He helped Betty install a program that she could now use to control her husband's social networking and messenger accounts. "If you don't know me, I don't know you." Half jokingly, half seriously, the young man warned. Betty could now see all of her husband's correspondence with family and friends, co-workers, partners, but most importantly with her, with the young blue-eyed Jenna who had intruded into their family. Of course, the woman felt some remorse because she had so treacherously invaded the personal space of the man she loved. But on the other hand, he had done far worse to her. Betty quickly realizes that things between Jenna and Mason are quite serious. She lives in his corporate apartment, cooking him delicious dinners there when Mason flies to Boston on business. Apparently, she tries very hard, specifically looking for exquisite recipes, not like Betty herself. Work and a child take so much energy and time, so she has recently had enough only for pasta and sausages, and the apartment is often not cleaned. However, Mason has never once expressed dissatisfaction with the domestic moments. On the contrary, when time allowed him, He took care of household chores without any indulgence, but maybe he still lacked care and attention, Betty. With the arrival of the long-awaited child, the woman did indeed spend much less time with her husband. Perhaps what happened was her fault. No, that's the wrong way to think about it. It's not easy for her either. But it's not like she went looking for a comforting lover. Mason and Jenna occasionally flew together for vacations. Betty realized this from the correspondence, in which there were phrases like "when we were in Italy" or "resorts by the warm sea, we've been many times before. I want to try something new. Maybe the Scandinavian countries? Sounds like they've traveled halfway around the world. That was a shame." Betty was sympathetic to her husband's busy schedule. Yes, they didn't spend much time together, but the woman believed that her husband was working for the good of their family. And now it turned out that many of these business trips were just a cover for traveling with Jenna. Reading the correspondence, Betty realized a lot. This girl is really in love with Mason, and him. Jenna gives him what her husband cannot get in the family: passion, free time, vivid emotions, blind adoration. But if he was really ready to leave his wife for her, he would have done it already. Mason is clearly serious about Jenna, but apparently doesn't really love her. Except things can change. For example, the young mistress will give him a child, and then Mason will never leave them. Or anything else for that matter. Slowly Jenna can bind her man to herself, make him fall in love with himself. So she had to act decisively and as quickly as possible, but she couldn't come up with a plan. And Kelly couldn't offer any advice. "I'm a single mom. What kind of counselor am I?" she said, confused. "Just know that if you need my help, I'm always here for you." "Thank you. You've been so helpful. At least now I know the ins and outs of their relationship." "What's it like? How does it feel to know your husband's not going on a business trip?" But to her, it hurts, Betty admitted, but it's still better than being in the dark. Jenna had been thinking about starting her own business for a long time. She decided to try to open several dispensing centers of a popular online store. The girl thoroughly studied all the necessary information and made a business plan, but the accumulated funds were clearly not enough to start. Jenna was sure that Mason would gladly help her. He always supported all her endeavors and encouraged her development in any sphere. This time, too, Mason was pleased with the idea of a mistress. "That's a wonderful idea." He praised it. "And the direction is promising. With paperwork, if anything, I'll help. Only I do not have enough money." And Jenna voiced the missing amount, quite decent, but not astronomical for Mason. "I can't take out so much at once. I'll fly to New York. You remind me, I'll transfer it." As it was agreed, Jenna sent Mason a text message with a reminder about the money transfer. Her lover never refused her anything. The girl was used to it, so she had no doubt that now she would get what she wanted. But the message about crediting the funds did not come, and time was running out. It was necessary to pay rent, advertising, utilities, and purchase racks for storage. So Jenna texted Mason again, to which she received a reply that he was looking into the matter. Eventually, Mason called and informed her in a frustrated voice that it wasn't going to work out. His family urgently needed money for something. Jenna did not get into the details. The man promised that he would definitely help her next month. The girl leaned back in her chair. Now she clearly felt second best. The family needed money, and Mason had chosen his wife in this situation, easily and without the slightest doubt. Next to him, Jenna was used to feeling superior to everyone else. Perhaps she was even in love with this self-perception, but now the girl fully saw the disadvantages of her status. She is only a mistress. Not even entitled to take offense, Mason does so much for her as it is. Betty, of course, read a text message from Jenna in which the mistress reminded Mason that he promised to give her money for business development. That message both pleased and angered the woman. At the same time pleased by the fact that the girl apparently takes good advantage of her husband's opportunities. Mason cannot ignore this. He is far from being a fool. The easier it will be to convince him of the mercantile interest of the mistress, which against the background of sincere love and affection of his wife, will look especially ugly. And Betty was outraged that Jenna is too bossy with her husband's resources, and he, apparently, easily follows her lead. No way, Jenna. You're out of the family budget. That evening, Mason was late for work, and Betty had time to prepare a delicious dinner. Sitting at the table, her husband marveled at her culinary skills and praised the dishes. Better than a restaurant, husband confessed. I'm glad you like it, smiled Betty. How was your day? The usual. It was fine. I've just had my Infiniti breakdown, Betty confessed. Infiniti? Mason was surprised. I just bought you a car a while ago. It's a good, reliable car. I'll send the mechanics over tomorrow. No need. I already took it to the service myself. It needs repair. Expensive. How much? And then Betty said an amount only a little less than what the mistress had asked. Mason stopped talking, thinking. Betty realized he was considering whether he could help both his wife and Jenna at the same time, and deciding who to sponsor first. A lot depended on his choice now, and his wife helped him make it. I need a car urgently. Molly has a competition soon, training every day. I can't miss it, and I have to travel a lot for work every day. You know we have locations all over the city. Mason immediately transferred the necessary amount of money to Betty at the table. And then a little later the woman read a message from her husband, in which he justified himself to Jenna. The mistress never received the promised funds. What pleased Betty most was the fact that Mason had chosen her over Jenna. After all, the mistress also had a good enough reason. She wanted to start her own business, and yet her husband had helped his wife. Jenna must have noticed that, and now she's suffering. Serves her right. Let her know her place. The money situation upset Jenna and even disappointed her, but she pulled herself together and life went on as usual. The following month Mason did find the missing funds for her, and the girl started her business. She had a wise assistant and mentor in the person of her favorite man, so the experience was successful. Soon the invested money began to bring a good income. True, Jenna had more worries, but she even liked such business. She had no time and energy to think about her unenviable position as a mistress. She simply enjoyed Mason's presence in her life, his attention, his support, his patronage. She was still fascinated by his gray eyes, and she still melted at his touch as surely as she had on the first day of their acquaintance. Christmas was approaching, her favorite holiday since childhood. Jenna loved the scent of pine needles. She was mesmerized by the colorful lights, garlands. She was no longer a little girl, but, as before, she associated the end of December with the expectation of a miracle, and this time the miracle really happened. Mason sent a text message asking her to buy a beautiful new swimsuit instead of an evening gown for the corporate party. He suggested we fly together to the Arab Emirates on New Year's Eve weekend. Getting away for a few days from the hustle and bustle that always accompanies the end of the year sounded delightful. Of course, Jenna replied that she gladly accepted the offer and went to the mall that same day. She wanted to look flawless for Mason on this vacation. Jenna liked to see his rapturous gaze, to hear the compliments she received. So she picked up a beach closet, maximally emphasizing the numerous advantages of her appearance. The girl was sure that not only Mason will admire her on the beach, let her lover see what success his girl enjoys with others. Jenna had read somewhere that it greatly increases the value of the chosen one in the eyes of men. The girl was already anticipating how they would splash in the warm waters of the Persian Gulf and rock out at the local discos, and then rest in the luxurious apartments of the hotel. The trip promised to be wonderful. Jenna tried to behave with restraint, but in the end she could not resist the handsome student from England. He was 3 years younger than her and seemed to have a real crush on the American girl. Although Jenna immediately told him that their romance was purely resort for only a few days. The young man made her feel needed and admirable again, but Jenna realized that neither he nor anyone else could replace Mason. The pre-holiday weekend flew by like a blink of an eye. It was time to go home. Jenna realized that she missed Mason very much and was ready to forgive him anything. Although, of course, as they say, the resentment was gone, but the residue remained. Betty felt like a winner again. They just had a wonderful couple of days at the base, skiing and tubing, walking through the winter forest, roasting meat, drinking spicy mulled wine, playing board games in a big and friendly group. We laughed a lot and talked about interesting topics. Betty listened to a lot of thanks for the fact that she had guessed to bring everyone together and organize this trip. Most importantly, they were together at this time, Betty, Mason, Molly. There was no rushing or hurrying anywhere. Fully enjoying each other's company and hugging and laughing all the time. Betty decided that they needed to do this kind of outing more often. All of this was clearly good for their relationship. At first, Mason seemed anxious and lost. Apparently, he couldn't stop thinking about the lonely Jenna, but then he relaxed, calmed down, and began to enjoy the winter vacation. And the mistress flew to Dubai with a friend. That was wonderful. Betty sincerely hoped that she would meet some rich man there and not return to the USA. Why? Jenna is a blue-eyed blonde, a real beauty, so this option is quite possible. But as much as Betty didn't want it, the problem didn't solve itself. Jenna came back and immediately started texting Mason about how much she missed him. That was okay. Betty wasn't going to give up. Jenna had a favorite little brother. She'd raised him since he was a baby, helping his busy, tired mother. Now David was all grown up, 18 years old. Time has flown by quickly. From a cute, blonde-haired little kid, he turned into a handsome young man. He entered a sports college and was given a dormitory. Charles began his student life, of course. He often came to his sister. She was always happy to invite her relative and even helped him with money. But the young man wanted to earn money himself. "I'm looking for a job," one day he confessed to Jenna. "They promised to take me as a courier in the delivery service. You'll be in the snow and in the cold to travel around the city with a huge box on your shoulders." My sister shook her head. "And get change for it. You don't even have a car, so you should at least drive it. Otherwise, you'll be walking and taking buses." But what can I do? For now, we'll see. Everyone works somehow. Everyone? Jenna frowned. It's different for everyone. And the older sister reminded her brother of a story that had recently happened in their town. A courier, a young girl, brought an order to an apartment and fell into the clutches of drunken guys. The girl miraculously survived the encounter with the scumbags. But it was a girl. I'm a man. David brushed it off. What's the comparison? You think because you're a guy, you're safe? Well, sort of. David smiled. Come on, you're getting a little shady around town. It used to be quieter. All right, I'll talk to someone. Maybe I can get you a job driving for our firm. There's probably plenty of applicants. Your salaries are good. Yes, There are a lot of applicants. Agreed Jenna. But not every one of them has a sister working in the personnel department. Of course, the girl immediately wrote to Mason. In their branch, there was indeed a vacancy for a driver to unload materials. As a member of the Human Resources Department, Jenna could not help but know about it. The work is not much, the pay is good. David would be able to combine study and work perfectly and would not need money. Mason replied that he would take care of the matter. Jenna was sure that tomorrow or the day after tomorrow she would register her brother for a vacant position. Betty read the post about the vacancy and wondered. Another request that could be used in the struggle for marital happiness. The mistress would again be left with nothing. The woman suddenly remembered that she had a nephew living in Boston, so she dialed the number of a great aunt, his mother. It turned out that the nephew works at a local factory, works hard, and gets change. The situation was perfect. Betty happily told her aunt about the job opening and promised to talk to her husband. How did you know the Boston branch needed a driver? Mason looked at his wife in surprise. She had just asked him to hire her great-nephew for the job, describing beforehand how important the relationship with those relatives was to her and how she wanted to help them. I happened to run into Kathy, your boss's wife, at the mall. Mason wondered how bad the timing of all this was. After all, he'd promised a spot to Jenna's brother. She's gonna be upset again, but we already found someone. Mason, I called Human Resources. The position is still vacant. Say no to that person. Say it's taken. Do you have any idea what my aunt did for me? I just have to pay her back. A good job for her son is what's needed. Oh, please, for my sake. Mason heartily texted Jenna to tell her that he couldn't take her brother's job. Of course, the girl was upset. Resentment squeezed her heart. She even threw a plate on the floor in a fit of anger. Again, she was sidetracked. And the next day, the new driver added fuel to the fire. A radiant young man came to apply for a job. He happily shared that he had been told about the position by his great-aunt from New York, the wife of the Boston branch manager Mason. So once again Betty, without realizing it herself, had screwed things up. Jenna felt herself slowly beginning to hate the woman. She was the reason Mason repeatedly rejected her requests, and he was becoming more and more frustrating. It seemed that Mason was gradually burning out. Their protracted relationship was becoming more and more like a habit. Jenna was very sad to realize it, because the girl still wanted to be near him, to hear his voice, to see attentive gray eyes, and yet the girl realized more and more clearly that their romance would lead to nothing. She had realized it from the beginning, but then passion overshadowed all rational thoughts. Jenna felt herself next to Mason exceptional and unique. He seemed willing to do anything for her. Mason really did a lot for Jenna, but lately his attention was clearly not enough for her. He was always dealing with family problems, working a lot. It was so humiliating to be on the sidelines, especially with so many available men around who would be happy to be near her. Come visit me this weekend. I miss you so much, asked Jenna. Mason hadn't been in Boston in over a month. Baby, I can't. There's a lot of work at the head office. Maybe it's the wife again. Mason sighed. He must have loved Jenna in his own way. He sure did. Why else couldn't he break off a relationship that had grown too serious? He liked a lot of things about her. Good looks, determination, wisdom. Despite her youth, Jenna was remarkably adequate. She never threw tantrums, never drove him crazy. Mason was sure that she would not get pregnant in order to marry him, and would not call Betty with offers to leave her husband. But lately, Jenna has been a little too jealous of his wife. Yes, indeed, there have been several incidents in which Mason has shown that family is more important to him than anything else. But he's never hidden that from Jenna. He admitted on their first date that he wasn't single, and several times during their time together, the man was ready to let her go when she wanted to leave. But Jenna had always come back, and Mason had been genuinely happy about it. He'd probably gotten used to having her around by now. Beautiful, in love, not too demanding, understanding. It was a shame that her behavior was changing. But maybe it's just some crisis in the relationship. It's necessary to be patient a little, and everything will be back to normal. Jenna sat with a glass of champagne in a bubble bath. Being a village girl from a poor family, she never dreamed of such a life. A high-paying job, luxurious interiors, her own small business, a beautiful car, and a man she loved. True, things were not so smooth with the man. He belonged to another, and lately it was indicated more and more often and more vividly. Just at one moment, everything went wrong, as if someone upstairs decided that Jenna had enough personal happiness. Mason's not coming again, citing work, but it's probably all about family. I wonder if she needed help. Would he give up his wife, his kid, his office to support her? I'd have to see if he'd lie. But it's a test, and the future of their relationship depends on how Mason reacts. If he drops everything and flies to her, they'll be together. No. Jenna will pack her things and go to her mother's village for a few months, quit her job. Mason will be there. The business will be entrusted to Christina for the time being. She's her right-hand woman now. Her friend's in the loop. She'll be fine without her. And Jenna will get over her illness, cry and go back to being free. But that's plan B. The girl still hoped Mason would rush to her like he used to. Maybe in time he would even leave his wife, and they would build a family of their own. The phone clicked with a special beep, meaning Mason had a message from Jenna. Betty quickly read it. Okay, that makes sense. New request. The mistress is complaining to her husband about feeling awful vascular problems and wild headaches. I can't do anything. Probably have to go to the hospital. I need help with my business and personal support from my loved one. Betty thought about it. Her intuition told her it was a lie. Jenna is a young girl in the prime of life. The woman had seen the recent pictures she had sent her husband on a regular basis. In them, Jenna was strikingly fresh. Clean, radiant skin, light blush, bright eyes. Looking at the pictures, Betty thought that youth was still beautiful in itself. The girl clearly didn't look sick. Of course, all sorts of things happen. Her hypertensive crisis came on suddenly. But even if Jenna was really sick, let her heal herself. She was not a little girl. Mason took her to a high-paying position, helped her to establish a business, so the money for treatment at Madam clearly has, and care and attention let and demand from close relatives. No, Betty will not let her husband go to Boston anytime soon. Except that she has to come up with a reason, but she'll manage. Lately, Betty felt like she was just a generator of ideas. It didn't take long to think of one. When Betty was picking up her daughter from figure skating practice, she noticed a colorful poster on the wall of the sports center. A grand performance of the section's pupils at the big stadium was planned. The show promised to be bright and colorful. Betty approached Coach Molly. "Hello, why isn't my daughter in the show?" "Molly's not ready yet. She has great prospects. Next year she will definitely show herself, but right now. Perhaps she needs extra lessons? I'm ready to pay for them, as long as my daughter gets to this concert. You see, we have elderly relatives visiting us. This may be the last time they come to New York. If they could see Molly, it would make them happy." "I understand, but does your section need new equipment? If you put Molly on the program, I'll get it for you." All right. With apparent reluctance, the coach agreed. only Molly will have a cameo. She is still small, and it doesn't matter. Betty shined. The main thing is that Molly will perform. At dinner, Mason said that the day after tomorrow, he would be flying to Boston to solve some work issues. Couldn't the business trip be rescheduled? Betty pretended to be surprised and upset by the news. Why? Something urgent again? I wanted to tell you such happy news. Our Molly has been accepted to perform at the Ice Palace. She's the smallest person in the show. Can you believe it? Mason looked proudly at his daughter sitting next to him. You're doing great. You're the star of the ice. Yes. Molly lowered her eyes modestly. I'm good. I've worked so hard, and now I'm going to perform. You're coming to watch, right, Daddy? Mason looked into his daughter's hopeful eyes. The man's choice was obvious. Jenna would soon receive another rejection. Another Betty-directed situation that should contribute to the destruction of the relationship, mistress and husband. Jenna was packing her things. She did not want to leave her apartment, which for 4 years had become almost native, but the girl was determined. This time she is definitely leaving Mason. He has shown her time and time again that family is more important to him. Jenna will always be in second place for him, even perhaps in third place. Then there's the job she adores. She's already bought the train tickets at the office. She herself has drawn up an order for her dismissal. The story's over. Jenna realized that she wanted to be the only one for her man. Perhaps it was time to start a family of her own. Christina recently got married and is now expecting a son. Looking at the family happiness, friends, Jenna realized that she dreams of the same, but a husband and a child. All of this is unthinkable while she's in a relationship with Mason. It was time to put a stop to it. Jenna no longer resented Mason, only the pain of knowing he loved another woman. The man had done so much for her, the girl felt grateful to him, and she would be sure to tell him that to his face or over the phone. But later, not now. Now it is necessary to wait it out, to get over it, to hide for a while. And then a new life would begin. Mason watched Molly's performance. He had come to the Ice Palace with a tricked-out professional camera. Betty watched as he tried to catch his daughter in the frame, not often succeeding. Just as the coach had warned, Molly flashed in the back rows, but the proud father didn't seem to notice. His eyes burned with genuine admiration for his child. Next to him lay a bouquet of roses prepared for the little star. Then the phone beeped again, the same beep that had alerted him to messages from Jenna. Mason didn't pay attention to the sound. He was completely absorbed in his daughter's performance, and Betty, of course, immediately read the text message and smiled victoriously. Jenna asked him not to look for her. She said it was over between them. She even quit her job at the Mason branch so she wouldn't have to see him. Sounds like a win to me. Although, of course, it's too soon to relax. Mason, back in his empty Boston apartment, felt an acute sense of guilt. Taken 4 years of Jenna's life. She could have met her destiny, gotten married, had children instead of wasting her youth on a futile relationship. His conscience was soothed only by the fact that he still helped this girl to establish a business and become financially independent. But the sadness and regret that he and Jenna were not together now, strangely enough, was not there. On the contrary, the man even felt relieved. Now he wouldn't have to flit between his wife and his mistress, trying to pay attention to both. There would no longer be that oppressive feeling of guilt in front of Jenna and Betty. The situation had resolved itself. Lucky. Betty was celebrating the victory with her best friend Kelly. The women were sitting at a pizza place near their office. It was lunch hour. Good for you. Kelly praised the woman. She overcame her resentment, was able to forgive the man she loved, and kept her family together. She pulled it off so masterfully, and it's like she had nothing to do with it. Yes, I'm a strategist, it turns out. Betty agreed. Mason, I think, has come to value family even more. At least he's trying to make time for us. But, Mason's already had an affair. I don't want to scare you, but it's almost certain to happen again if he's capable of it. What are you gonna do then? Well, Betty set her glass down on the table. A cold determination appeared in her gaze. Well, in that case, I already know exactly what to do.